Welcome to the Budget Committee meeting of the 26th of September 2024. I would just like to start off with a brief round of introductions. We're quite a full house here, but for record purposes, we'll start with the members to my left. I am Peter Johnson. I am the chairperson of this committee. Member Masipa.
Good afternoon. My name is Noko Masipa. I am a permanent member of this portfolio committee. Thank you.
I'm Thomas Walters. I'm an alternate and also in my capacity as the Chair of Police Oversight, Community Safety and Sport and Cultural Affairs. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Chair. Wendy Kaiser-Philander.
Afternoon, Chair. Pat Lecker.
Good afternoon, Chair. Beauty Stoffel, member of the committee.
Good afternoon, colleagues and our learned friends. I'm Memory Boyson. I'm an alternate member of this committee. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairperson. Good afternoon, MEC. I'm Noel Constable. I'm an alternate to this committee. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Leon van Wyk. I'm an alternate member of the committee and chair of the Education Standing Committee.
Afternoon, I'm French Mbombo.
Hello, everybody. Dave Bryant.
Good afternoon, everyone. Benedicta van Minnen.
Good afternoon, Killian Postman.
Good afternoon, Derek Wessels.
Good afternoon, I'm Nomi Nkondlo.
Good afternoon, Ayanda Barnes.
Thank you, members, and welcome. Honourable Minister.
Afternoon, Deirdre Portman.
Good afternoon, Chair, members, Tulinda Gantana.
Good afternoon, Annelies Pick, Provincial Government Public Finance.
Good afternoon, Malcolm Boyson, Public Policy Services.
Good afternoon, Philippus Prinsloo.
Good afternoon, Taryn van der Rede, Provincial Government Budget Office.
Good afternoon, Jacques Barnard, the part of the Premier, standing in for Dr. Zinat Ismail on non-financial performance data.
Good afternoon, Faisal Nurin, Department of the Premier.
Good afternoon, Paul Pinar, Business Information and Data Management, Provincial Treasury.
Afternoon, Michelle Nicholas, Provincial Government Finance.
Good afternoon, Ziad Majid, Infrastructure, Provincial Treasury.
Good afternoon, Carmen Mirage, Provincial Government Budget Office.
Good afternoon, Sean Kirsten, Provincial Budget Office.
Good afternoon, Chad Capon, Provincial Government Budget Office.
Good afternoon, members. Jonathan Hendricks, Provincial Government Budget Office.
Thank you, everyone. Mr. Davids, just for record purposes, if you can just introduce yourself.
Thank you, Chairperson. Through yourself, members, officials, Minister, Dustin Davids, Procedural Officer.
Thank you very much. Just in terms of apologies, we have just received one apology from member Basil Pietrus, and member Noel Constable is the alternate member for member Basil Pietrus. Mr. Davids, I'm sure I don't have to ask this, but I'm sure we do have a quorum for this meeting.
You are correct, Chairperson. We do have quorum. You may proceed, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Davids. We have quite a hefty agenda, but firstly, congratulations to the new minister for tabling your first pero. With that being said, over to the HOD for the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. We're going to form a little bit of a tag team. The Budget Office is going to take us through the presentation.
Thank you, HOT. So the Western Cape is at a critical juncture as economic challenges tighten and public service demands heighten. There's a decline in certain key sectors on the long run, like construction and manufacturing, which is a challenge. Add that energy risks, the extent of crime, and service delivery pressures on healthcare and education. Although agricultural sector success offers hope, that will require targeted policies that are essential to address these various challenges effectively. The true measure of society is not just in how one handles success, but how it navigates challenges. What is new for this year's Pero? It's a fully internal PT publication with assistance of the BER. There's substantially more academic paper citations. There's an increased use of SARS-sourced employment and GVA data in the form of maps. And 32 new data sets were analyzed. Next, please. So just going through the Pero outline, it's basically more or less the same as last year. So chapter 1 was authored by me, chapter 2 by Sean Kirsten, chapter 3 by Chad Capon, chapter 4 Jonathan Hendricks, and chapter 5 Carmen Maharaj. In terms of the global economic context, it is the IMF's outlook for the global economy is 3.2% for 2024 and 3.3% in 2025. It is, although it is shows resilience, it recovered from the COVID recession. It is still below historical averages. Various risks persist, and this include relatively high borrowing cost, reduced fiscal support that will exclude the US, still lingering COVID impacts, as well as geopolitical tensions. We have to focus on our largest trading partner, that is China. We export 11.2% in 2023, while our import share was 20.4%. Risks for the Chinese economy include a weaker domestic demand, real estate challenges, supply and demand imbalances, particularly in the pork industry. And then they also have a relatively high youth unemployment rate of 17%. In the long run, South Africa needs to take note of their aging population. The IMF predicts that the growth rate of the Chinese economy will go down to about 3.3% in 2029. But for the current outlook, it remains relatively strong at 5% in 2024 and 4.5% in 2025. So we compared in terms of GDP per capita, that is measured in international dollars or triple P. We compared countries with relatively similar GDP per capita. And this is from the World Bank. South Africa, unfortunately, declined the past decade by 6.3%, while Georgia and China expanded significantly. Georgia by 58.9% and China by 59.4%. So we looked at academic papers that try to explain this performance of Georgia and China, and we came to the following conclusions. The success behind Georgia was low corruption, minimal bureaucracy, simple procedures, and low tax burden. For China, it was market-oriented reforms, foreign direct investment, and special economic zones with flexible investment policies. Just having a look at recent results for South Africa, the second quarter, that's the latest result. You can just go back a slide back, please. Yeah. So South Africa expanded in the second quarter by 0.4%. The largest positive growth contributions were made by the finance sector at 0.3 percentage points, after expanding in the quarter by 1.3 percentage points, or 1.3%. The largest negative growth contributions were made by the transport sector, minus 0.2 percentage points, and agriculture also at minus 0.1 percentage point. We also have to have a look in a broader context, South African growth. Over the past decade, there's basically 4 sectors that underperformed. That was your utilities, manufacturing, mining, and construction. In fact, construction is today 27.5% smaller than a decade ago. Just looking at the outlook for South Africa, from S&P Global. Growth for this year is forecasted at 1%, next year at 1.6%. This is a higher growth rate than the average of 0.8% the past decade. But it's fairly close to our population growth rate of 1.4%. What stands out in the outlook is the positive outlook for the construction sector, which is expected to grow at 4.7% in 2024, most likely to the very low baseline of the construction sector. This sector declined for 7 consecutive years. Also, the start of the lowering rates of interest will have a positive impact on real estate and construction. And then government construction initiatives as listed in the National Infrastructure Plan 2050, as well as increased investment in renewable energy projects, will boost the sector. Also to note, the important contribution of the finance sector, 0.5 percentage points in 2024 and 0.7 percentage points in 2025. Next slide. Thank you. Looking at inflation, we've been fortunately in a declining trend since August 2022. The last inflation measurement was 4.6% in July 2024. That is very close to the South African Reserve Bank's mid-target rate of 4.5, and possibly then contributed to the 25 basis point cut that we received on 19 September. So the repo rate were up until recently relatively high at 8.25%, and that was a 14-year high. And this rate stood since May 2023. Further rate cuts are expected late in the year, and this was before the 25 basis point cut. So we can, according to Standard Bank, another 50 basis points. Just having a look at the impact of inflation and fiscal pressures on the government's budget is the slide on the right. We can see that by incorporating for inflation, the Western Cape government budget declined for 3 consecutive years. And obviously, this will have an impact on service delivery. As an example, we can take housing. Housing demand surged by 83.2% over the past decade, while funding and delivery declined over more or less the same period. Housing delivery declined by 70%, service sites declined by 90%, and national funding declined by 41% in real terms. We're in the midst of an electricity crisis, but there's light in the tunnel. We can see that the private sector is expanding its footprint in electricity supply. Electricity production over the past decade, today it's declined by 12.4%. However, the share of non-Eskom electricity production increased from 4.4% in 2013 to 13.3% in 2023. Therefore, an expansion of 163.9%, which is quite significant. This year, fortunately, we have relatively few load shedding days, 83 in total. As up to 18 September, we had 179 days of no load shedding. And compared to last year, we only had 30 days of no load shedding. And a big part of this recovery can be ascribed to Kusile Unit 5 that recently became operational, and that added additional 800 megawatts to the grid. Looking at the greenfield investment in the Western Cape and jobs created. Greenfield investments is when businesses are built from the ground up. So that's an injection for our economy, and it's very important, and that's why we track it. So for 2023, 6.9 billion was invested in the Western Cape. Unfortunately, that is a 51.7% decline from the previous year. However, over 3,000, almost 3,200 jobs were created in the process. Business services were provided the bulk of investments in 2023. For its 3.1 billion investment, 475 jobs were created. And what is quite interesting, if you compare the different industries in greenfield investment with the jobs created, you get a sense of some industries, it's very expensive to create one job, and others less so. For example, green energy created only over the past decade now, created only 0.9% of total jobs, with a cost to job ratio of 72.2 million per job. Compare that to software and IT that created almost 7,000 jobs, or almost 40% of all the jobs over the decade, and that is 1.8 million rand per job. Looking at electricity in the Western Cape, provided by Eskom, it also declined by 20.8% the past decade. Load shedding had a tremendous cost on the Western Cape economy. That was calculated at 12.8 billion of our GDP. That is about 2.2 percentage points of our GDP growth. However, there's some positivity again from the private sector. So the total demand for Western Cape electricity is around 4,368 megawatts for 2024. And it was estimated that there's 535 megawatts of solar PV has since been installed. That's 12.2% of the Western Cape's total demand for electricity, which is positive. Of this 535 megawatts, 220 megawatts was registered with municipalities in the Western Cape. Just looking at the outlook of the Western Cape, which will normally sort of track the national economy, the outlook is a bit more positive at 1.3% in 2024 and 1.8% in 2025. And again, the finance sector is going to make an important contribution of 0.6 percentage points, followed by transport and construction at 0.2 percentage points each. And to note that the Western Cape recovered from the COVID recession. The Western Cape economy is now 1.1% larger than the quarter prior to COVID. And very importantly, our employment increased by 9.6% over the same period, while our population expanded by 6.9%. Just having a look at real exports in the Western Cape, it expanded by 106.9% over the past decade. Agriculture did extremely well with 190.7% of the growth. Our largest export sector is the manufacturing sector, but that expanded by 56.7%, around less than a third of agriculture's growth. But very surprising, in the other section on that figure, you'll find mining. Mining is not a big share of exports in the Western Cape, but it is growing rapidly. In 2014, mining share of our total real exports was 2.8%, and it since increased to 10.5%. And we tried to find an explanation for this growth in mining exports, and we found that manganese exports expanded the last 5 years by over 1,000%. There's a lot of manganese mines located in Northern Cape, so logistically it makes sense to channel our exports then through Cape Town Port. I'm going to hand over to Taryn. It's going to complete the presentation.
So when delving deeper into the labour market dynamics, we'll be focusing on two areas, essentially employment and unemployment, but I would urge the members to have a look at the additional detail and statistical analysis that we've also included as part of the labour market chapter itself. So overall, when we're looking at employment trends and insights, we're comparing the second quarter of 2019 to the second quarter of 2024. When looking at the employment gains and losses, you will see that employment in the Western Cape overall increased by 7.1% over this period of time, which is an overall contribution of 52.2% to the national gains in employment. When we are delving deeper into the sector analysis, you will see that the growth in terms of employment was largely concentrated in the finance, community services, and private households. This showcases the fact that our employment gains is largely services sector orientated, whereas on the other hand, we've seen declines in terms of trade, manufacturing, and the agriculture sectors. This is unfortunate trend given the fact that we actually have a comparative advantage in the agriculture sector, and also including the manufacturing, which are labor absorbing sectors, particularly in terms of semi-skilled and unskilled labor. Also, we have many opportunities in trade, so we really need to start thinking a little bit differently about how we secure investment into these sectors and continue to support these sectors so that they are able to absorb our labor market. Then we're looking at changes in the Western Cape employment per demographic cohort, also a comparison between the second quarter of 2019 and the second quarter of 2024. You will see that the highest employment growth between 2019 and 2024 were for Africans, females, older age, and more educated cohorts. These trends in terms of the employment is also aligned to that of the national trends. However, on the flip side, those with a less than secondary education saw a decline in employment of 11.6%, therefore also emphasizing the importance of us to continue investing in our education sector. Next slide. So then when looking at the unemployment trends and insights and the provincial comparisons, you will see in South Africa it ranges essentially between 22.2% and 41.3%. So essentially unemployment continues to be a major challenge in South Africa, particularly when you compare it to global standards, with South Africa's average at 33.5%. When looking at the district comparisons, you'd also see that increase in City of Cape Town's unemployment rate, and then also a lower level of unemployment, particularly on the West Coast side. So with regards to the City of Cape Town, that's largely as a result of the in-migration into the city, and then also the lower levels in the West Coast as a result of the sector development in that area. Then when looking at growth in unemployment rates in terms of the major cohorts in the Western Cape, unemployment growth increased among all the cohorts, most notably the less than secondary at 3.8%, older age at 3.6 points, and Africans at 2.8 points. Unemployment rate is also the highest amongst the African population, accounting for 31.5% in the second quarter of 2024. Then when looking at the Western Cape population, you'll see that there was a remarkable increase in the population growth within the province at 19.6% between the period of 2015 and 2024. As Minister also stated in her speech, the Western Cape should prepare to accommodate an additional 1.196 million people. This is by 2026, and this is largely as a result of the net in-migration of 51.2% of total population growth. It's also expected that this increase in migration is largely as a result or coming from the Eastern Cape as well as Limpopo. Then also very interesting is the fact that the fertility rate is seeing a decrease from 2.27 between 2001 and 2006 to 1.95 between 2021 and 2026. This is also as a result of the educational attainment among women, which is emerging as a primary factor influencing this shift in trend, and also positively indicating the fact that we have more females positively participating in the labor market. Then when looking at the poverty rates, the absolute number of people living below the lower bound poverty line has increased between 2013 and 2022, nearing 3.7 million people. Quite significant is the spike in 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2022, it's accounting for 51% of the total Western Cape population, which is below the lower bound poverty line, and this is also accounting for a decline of 1.9 points from 2013. Then we're looking further into our population structure. We're looking at the Human Development Index, which is essentially a composite index ranging between 0 and 1. 1 being the higher level of human development and 0 being the lower level of human development. It also tracks indicators across education, health, and standard of living. And when you can see within the Western Cape and across all the various districts, there's been an increase between 2002 and 2012 2022, as well as an increase in the HDI for South Africa. Similar trends are seen for the Gini coefficient for South Africa, the Western Cape, and across the various districts. There's been a decline over the period between 2002 and 2022. Then when looking at the Western Cape share of age groups, we're comparing the youth, the elderly, and the rest of the population. There's been consistent trends over time when you're looking between 2015 and 2024. The youth still accounts for the majority of our population, but we are starting to see a decline in the percentage of youth. And this is in comparison to actually seeing an increase in the elderly population, which is actually showcasing the fact that moving forward, there's going to be an increase in reliance of the elderly on the other population groups. Then moving over to education, education remains a key priority for the Western Cape. However, when unpacking some of the key statistics, we are highlighting a number of challenges, but also seen as opportunities for the province. Many of these statistics and analysis is not necessarily unique just to the Western Cape, but we're actually seeing these trends across provinces in South Africa, also highlighting the importance of the need for increased investment in education more broadly. So when looking between 2014 and 2023, we are seeing that there has been an increase in the number of learners by 19% between 2014 and 2023. However, this is compared to only a 0.5% increase in the number of schools. So basically, we are seeing an outpace in terms of the number of learners in comparison to our investment in terms of education facilities, resulting in an overcrowding within our classrooms, and this is also seen in terms of our learner-teacher ratios. So it's evident that we are foreseeing further challenges going forward if we don't necessarily hone in on some of these risks and challenges and also have the required increase in investment in this sector. So between 2014 and 2023, the learner-teacher ratio has risen from 28.4% to 35.4%. And this is also showcasing the fact that with the increase in learner-teacher ratios, that it could risk education outcomes, place teachers under pressure, and overall the education sector. On the positive side, in the Western Cape, we have seen a great improvement in terms of the retention rates, which has improved from 86% in 2019 to 93% in 2023 for primary schools. Retention rates have also improved in terms of high schools from 65% to 71% in 2023. This then means that more students are actually completing their school education and also resulting in positive outcomes with regards to employment probabilities. Then when looking at health, another area where we are also seeing a number of pressures, specifically since the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, we have seen a decrease in the number of doctors as well as a decrease in the number of nurses. And this is against an increase in the growth of the population, which essentially exceeded the growth of the number of nurses and the number of doctors, therefore also significantly placing the sector under pressure. On the positive side, however, we are seeing, when you're looking at the public healthcare patient service in the Western Cape, that there has been an increase in the home and community-based care. And as Minister was saying in his speech, it also showcases the innovations that have been applied by the Department of Health and Wellness. However, we are also seeing an increase in the PHC total headcount, specifically since the COVID-19 pandemic, and therefore also placing the health services sector under significant pressure. Another challenge that we are also highlighting here is the issue around mental well-being, which is largely reflected in the extent of anxiety, depression, and also substance abuse. This translates into an increase in psychiatric admissions, and specifically the specialized psychiatric services. So you can see within that graph the overall increase in trend between 2014-15 and 23-24. Also translating from the mental well-being issues is the number of suicides in the Western Cape. It is also showcasing an increasing rate between 2014-15 to 23-24. Then when looking at crime interventions in the Western Cape, overall crime trends in the Western Cape presents a mixed picture. We have seen notable improvements in terms of burglary at residential premises, driving under the influence of alcohol, drugs, drug-related crime, as well as sexual offences. However, on the other hand, the murder rate has increased by 43%. In addition, we have also, in terms of the graph on your left-hand side, done a comparison before and after the LEAP deployments in our 13 hotspot areas. What we have seen in terms of this analysis is there's been a decrease in sexual offences, robbery of residential premises, driving under the influence of alcohol and drugs. However, still seen in these hotspot areas is an increase in the murder rate as well as an increase in drug-related crimes. So while we have seen successes in terms of the implementation of our safety plan in the Western Cape, we're also highlighting with the continued challenges with regards to murder and drug-related crime that we should take both the approach of violence prevention as well as law enforcement in order to effectively tackle our crime statistics. With that, I'm going to hand over to my HOD for the concluding remarks.
Thank you, Taryn, Chair. We've always considered the peril as a key publication in providing and supporting the evidence-led decision making, and I think this is particularly important given where we find ourselves in terms of the planning cycle, when we are looking at both the PSP, SPs of votes, as well as working towards the first full year of APPs in terms of the 7th administration. So what are the key messages amongst the many that we find in this year's publication of the Provincial Economic Review and Outlook? Firstly, the national economic performance. It's important to note that the sluggish performance of the national economy has reduced and impacted the streams for the Western Cape, revenue streams for the Western Cape. And then we see an increasing demand for public services. In terms of construction and the manufacturing sector decline, the construction and manufacturing sectors have experienced significant contractions over the past decade, which then necessitates thoughtful policy interventions from government to support the recovery and revitalization in the coming decade. Thirdly, in terms of our electricity risk, despite improvements in 2024, we still see that it remains a risk to the provincial economy, and therefore it necessitates then the localized energy projects and energy efficiency measures. In terms of education, our growing learner-teacher ratio, as well as our declining real budgets for the education department, places an increased pressure on the quality of education in the province. Next slide. We look at healthcare and the strain as well, strain on our healthcare system, as well as mental health surge, healthcare workforce growth in the Western Cape clearly lags behind our population growth. That then leads to a decline in nursing capacity, while mental health issues surge, as well as what we see a surge in is in terms of our regional disparities. In terms of our crime, mixed crime trends, a murder rate surge despite our overall decline. So
Members using the online platform, please ensure that your mics are muted. Apologies, HOD. Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you, Chair. Almost there. In terms of mixed crime, a murder rate surge despite our overall decline. Crime what we've seen is significant reductions in various crimes in the Western Cape over the past decade. But of concern is indeed the alarming increase in terms of our murder rate, which is at 43%, and that highlights persistent and severe challenges in terms of law enforcement. In terms of the agriculture sector outperformance, I think it is a beacon of hope there. The agriculture sector has significantly outperformed in economic growth and exports over the past decade, which then indicates a competitive advantage that can be leveraged to strengthen ties with the underperforming manufacturing sector. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, HOD, and to the officials from Provincial Treasury for the presentations. Members, we will now move over to some questions. I would like to ask you to please be mindful of time. We still have 2 quarter performance reports to deal with. So when you ask your questions, please refrain from making lengthy statements and ask your questions. Any questions from members, please indicate. I see Member Masipa, I see Member Constable and Member Nkondlu. Let's do the first 3 questions and then we will take some more. Member Masipa, over to you.
Thanks, Chairperson, and thanks to the presenters. Slide number, there's no number, but on the, there's no number on the slides. But anyway, I'm going to pose the question. You talk about South African economy expanded by 0.4 in second quarter. And obviously, you did indicate in the last line that the largest negative growth contribution is transport and agriculture. So what I want to know is that what is the Western Cape's outlook there? Because the second quarter, it talks the national economic growth, but it doesn't talk to the Western Cape. What is the Western Cape? And what is the attributes? What caused that? If you can maybe just assist there. The next slide is on the impact of inflation and weak economy. That's the headline. You also indicate that housing demand surged by 83.2%. What is the real number in terms of those percentage? What is the real number? If you can really share with us, I'll appreciate. If we can just get the real numbers in terms of housing delivery decline and the service size declined by 90% and so forth, and the national declined by 41%. If you can get the real numbers, I'll appreciate. Are you able to get the slide? Okay.
Actually, we'll get to that.
Let me know if I'm not. Yeah, and the next one you talk about with the surge in renewable energy investment in the Western Cape in 2023. You talk about the greenfield creating 3,179 jobs. At what cost? Because I mean, the argument from the labor has always been that green energy, take away jobs and so forth. If you can share if there has been some, it came at a cost of the jobs in other sector, the green energy as such. Yeah, the next one is on Western Cape employment recovered. That's the headline of the slide, agriculture export flourish. So the indication here, you might not be able to answer, but I'm going to pose the question. Is Western Cape economic outlook is 1.3% in 2024 and 1.8 in 2025. We are projecting to grow the economy to 1 trillion in 2035. The question is, at this rate, what is it putting us to in terms of the growth going forward? I think that's it from my side. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I think I was short to the point.
Thank you, Member Masipa. I really do appreciate it. It is quite short to the point for you. We then move over to Member Constable. Please go ahead, Member. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thanks for the presentation, colleagues. I just have some general questions, Chair. The presenters mentioned regions, but I haven't heard anything about Central Karoo. What is the data there? Specifically the Central Karoo. I'm very interested in what's happening in the Central Karoo with regards to economic outlook. Secondly, Chair, she mentioned 31% unemployment rate of Africans. What is the unemployment rate of colored people in the Western Cape? If you can give me that rate also with regards to the population. Chairperson, I think we will sometime discuss the protection of our small businesses against illegal foreigners in our communities. I think that is something that the PERO must also look into. How do we protect our people against illegal foreigners that also do businesses, and our businesses have to close down in our communities. There's something that they also mentioned, Chair, which is overcrowding in classrooms. I think that debate is still on. If we record this in the PERO, then I think MEC, with regards to budgeting for education, we need to make sure that we don't lay off the 2,400 teachers within the Western Cape. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Member Constable. Member Nkondlu, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Before I go to the presentation, Chair, perhaps we would need to help us, and the committee must help us understand how do we reconcile the issue of time allocation. Whilst I appreciate and respect the time we ought to give to all the reports and everything that must happen, we should take note of the fact that we come into a committee, we listen to the department giving a presentation for almost an hour, and then as members were expected to speak 2-3 minutes. And I think it's something that we need to work out in as far as time allocation is concerned, because this is a time of the committee, and therefore at least that must show in how the time is distributed. So can I continue to ask my questions?
No, but Member Nkondlu, we will be in this committee meeting until everyone's had the fair opportunity to ask all the questions that they have. So you may continue. Thanks.
Thank you. My first question, Chair, is that I would like to just get from what the Minister presented, I think in the PERO, in her speech. He speaks about, I think, citizens in the Western Cape in as far as inequality and the Gini coefficient that she made reference to, living a more better standard of life. I'm not sure what that means. Maybe she can explain more. And if one looks at the slide on the Human Development Index and the Gini coefficient, of the country versus that of the Western Cape, I think the slide itself indicates a Gini coefficient that is increasing in the Cape Metro, which is actually even higher than the province. So I'm trying to reconcile what the minister was speaking about. Perhaps she can elaborate better in as far as that is concerned, and the fact that even the presentation, I think on the other slide, speaks about the Western Cape population and poverty is growing. So if one tries to reconcile what Minister was raising and what are these indicators, maybe there's something that an ordinary, understanding of mine is not grasping. Maybe Minister can explain what she says. The other issue following from member who asked the racial demographic of unemployment in the province. I think data does demonstrate there also for the member to see the unemployment of the other races. And I would be interested actually to get to know according to data and the information that the department has, what is actually driving the high unemployment rate of the African population? And would that actually be applicable to the youth, which I think in that slide between 2019 to 2024, same quarters, I think we see there in terms of the racial profile, the youth, and those that are less than secondary. I think the numbers are very high, are up to 30%. So I think it's important for me just to understand what are the drivers of these groups between the Africans and the Coloureds that make them to actually stay very long, in this situation of unemployment. And then there's a slide, Chair, that I'm trying to understand on crime interventions. Perhaps the learned colleagues can explain to me, because this slide is trying to tell us about the average number of crimes in the hotspot areas and using a time lag of Q4 of 2018 to that of 2023. But where I'm missing is that the chosen quarters, if you look at the data that the department has identified here, is 6 quarters of 2018 and Q4 to Q1 of 2020 and 6 quarters of Q3 2022 to Q4. I'm not sure. Perhaps they could make me understand. I'm not a statistician, but I'm sure if one has to extrapolate data in trying to make reference and for someone to understand, surely it would be best if they were using actually the data of Q4 in these 6 quarters, but they choose different quarters, different years. I'm not sure why. They may be able to explain so that one is able to appreciate, the very time that they chose to bring this data to explain, the phenomenon of crime with LEAP and without the LEAP officers. So for now, I think it's just those clarities that I would seek. Thank you very much.
Thank you, members. Let's deal with the first 3 questions from members Masipa, Constable and Kondlu before we take the second round of questions. HOD, over to you, or the Minister and the HOD. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to deal with some of the little bit non-technical matters. I'll start with the Gini coefficient and so on. It's a little bit technical and a little bit non-technical. So I'm going to use an example of the HDI because there are different metrics. So there's the GDP metric, we have the poverty line, we have the HDI, and we have the Gini coefficient. So for example, in your para book, Chair, we'll have on page 103 is an example of what are the metrics that goes into the HDI from the United Nations Development Program in terms of that particular measurement. There's 3 key dimensions where they measure it. For HDI, for example, health is measured by life expectancy at birth. Your education is evaluated through the average years of schooling for adults and expected years of schooling for children, and standard of living assessed by your gross national income per capita. Gini coefficient specifically also addresses disparity. So an example would be when I became minister, my salary changed. But I didn't necessarily create a job in the economy because I lost one job in the one sector and I gained another job in another sector. So for me, Deirdre, there was 0 job gains, and that, for example, affects jobs and GDP. But it does affect the Gini coefficient in my area when my income and my salary changes. But I'm going to ask just that the team goes through the technical inputs that goes into GDP, that goes into HDI, that how the poverty line is calculated, and how the GDP, HDI, Gini coefficient, that was the 4th one, thank you. Just in terms of the different districts. So in some of the information during the book, you will see, remember that there are where we put them into different districts, the respective data in the respective chapters. But what is also going to happen, Chair, is there's also going to be a municipal economic review and outlook at the end of the year, where we then take all of the provincial data and we disaggregate it into the respective districts, that the person can then see much more clearer what is happening in one particular district. I know in my previous capacity, I always loved using it for my constituency to take the information and also to see what is happening in that area. But if there's a particular item that you're looking for, maybe we can just ask the team to respond to those items. In terms of the teachers and the possibility of laying off teachers, when we went to the National Budget Council and all of the ministers of finance were there from the respective provinces, and despite us as a Western Cape facing massive problems, the National Minister of Finance at that meeting indicated that he received 15 billion rand in request for COE just for this financial year coming through, and 9.8 billion rand of that 15 was request from KwaZulu-Natal, for example. And it doesn't diminish the situation that we are in as the Western Cape, because we do need to fight to make sure that frontline services are protected. And I then moved a respective resolution with that particular budget council, which is a very important council. It's similar to a MINMEC in different departments, to request that we must protect frontline workers, and that specifically deals with education and health matters, especially within the national budget process. I requested that the public wages must be funded fully, and because budget council resolutions must also go, some of them go through the national cabinet, because the national cabinet ends up deciding on whether the budget goes through or not, that I asked that can we please take this to the national extended cabinet on the 2nd of October as well, so we have their support to make sure that we mustn't just fight for the Western Cape, we must fight for all provinces, because it is going to affect all of our provinces in this current financial year. And I would just also ask that the team just explain, because, for example, some of the items that we were shown was how SOEs, for example, received funding and essentially bailouts, and how that affected different industries as well. Those are some of the slides that we were shown also at that particular council. My suggestion, Chair, for the SMME protection against illegal foreigners, that might be something to ask and interrogate with the Department of Economic Development and Tourism. What we aim to do with the PERO is really to table the specific data and the evidence that we have available to us, and so that these really informs our budgetary processes, our planning processes going forward. But that might be something for the committee and or the respective vote committee even to interrogate in that regard. And there are breakdowns of respective races in the PERO as well, with respective metrics. Some of the ones that I were able to find quickly now was, for example, page 67, 69, 71, 72, dealing with employment and labor matters. But specifically in terms of figures, I'm just going to ask that the team also assist in that regard. And HOD, I'm handing over all the technical matters to you.
Thanks, Minister. Maybe before I hand over to the team and the authors of the various chapters, maybe just in terms of I think one of Masipa's questions dealt actually with the growth for jobs strategy. So it's correct. It's a R1 trillion economy by 2035. And at the rate that we are currently growing, it is below what that target is, because we're supposed to go at least 4 to 6% per annum. Darren, are you going to pick up? Maybe can we deal with the per chapter author?
We're going to kick off with Philip, and then handing over to Chad on the labour, and then Sean will deal with the HDI and Genie questions.
Okay, thank you, Darren. In terms of the question on the second quarter data for the Western Cape, by the time we've written this book, that data was not out. That is normally estimated by Quantec. However, the data has since been released, and we will be able to give you a number on transport and agriculture and the Western Cape growth rate. I believe Sean do have the data currently, so he will provide you with the data. In terms of the real number of housing demand, the increase is the actual number is 292,529. Let's see if I'm just missed something here. On the Central Karoo data, we don't have an outlook on the Central Karoo. It's normally done in the Mero document, but we do have maternal and child mortality rates in the Central Karoo. We've got the average growth rate the past 10 years and the latest growth economic growth rate also per sector in the Central Karoo in the document. And cost of green energy jobs. On the cost of the green energy jobs, I'm not certain. We don't have that information whether it took jobs from other industries. So at that question, we don't have an answer for, and that we have to do some research to determine whether those investments in green energy actually took jobs away from other industries. And then on the unemployment rate, I believe Chad can help us with that.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, honourable members, for the questions. So, unemployment rate of the coloured cohort in the Western Cape is 18.9% as of Q2 2024. And then, in terms of what is potentially the likely driver of the high unemployment among the African cohort, I think there's lots of factors that could be driving it, but the research shows that it's most likely the higher education levels are generally associated with lower unemployment rates, and so that is what we think is also happening in the Western Cape. And as you alluded to, honourable member, that when you noted the high unemployment rates among the less than secondary, that's where we're seeing that relationship as well. The less than secondary cohort also has high unemployment rates. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you for the questions. On the Western Cape GDP, Q2 2024, it was 0.5% growth from Q1 to Q2, with the largest contribution coming from the finance sector. That was 0.4% contribution and percentage points. And then we've got the second largest contribution coming from manufacturing and wholesale and trading. So it was a 0.5% growth and the highest contribution coming from the finance sector in Q2 from Q1 2024. On the definitions of GDP, Gini coefficient and HDI. So your Gini coefficient measures your income inequality, with 0 being perfect equality and 1 being perfect inequality. Your HDI measures your Human Development Index. With the indicators there, they look at a long and healthy life measured by life expectancy at birth. You're looking at knowledge, so expected years of schooling, average years of schooling, a decent standard of living, looking at the gross national income per capita. So they use a couple of indicators to feed into the HDI, which is a Human Development Index, and that's different to the Gini coefficient, which is looking at income inequality specifically. Just going back to that, when you're looking at that, HDI ranges from 0 to 1. Higher values obviously indicating a higher level of human development versus 0 being a lower development. And the Gini coefficient is obviously from 0 to 1 being perfect equality at 0 and 1 in perfect equality. And that's how the different measurements are shown. Thank you, Chair.
On a question of the LEAP areas, the 6 quarters that were selected. So LEAP was implemented on a gradual basis. So not all 13 hotspot areas got LEAP officers from day one. And we decided to make a measurement. We need all 13 hotspot areas where LEAP officers were employed. And that's why we took 6 quarters. That's for 6 quarters, the LEAP officers were fully employed at all 13 areas. And we compared it then with 6 quarters of no LEAP officer deployment to make a fair comparison.
Thank you very much. HOD, is there anyone else from your team or the MEC?
So I just want to ask if we can just also explain how the poverty line gets calculated and that. So if we've done Gini coefficient and HDI.
So the poverty line is just an amount determined by Stats SA, and they've got different levels of poverty lines, and they decide on an amount, and I think this year's amount is about 1,450. I'm not sure the exact amount, but I can back you that on that. So they determine the amount, and if you earn less than that, then you fall below the poverty line and you're part of the statistic.
Thank you very much. Members, second round of questions. I already have Member Memory, Member Walters, and Member Masipa. I'll give you another round now. Let's just do Member Stoffel as the...
Sorry, Chair.
Yes,
One
Member.
question was not answered. One of my question was not answered.
Okay, members, before we get to the new round of questions, Member Masipa, which question was that?
Sorry, the question relate to the housing numbers that the indications are that it's surged by 83%. I've just asked to really explain what is the real number, if that can be answered. Thanks.
Thank you, Member Masipa. Before we get to that question, I think let's do the three new questions before we hand over to the team again. So, Member Boyson, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chairperson. Chairperson, mine is just a naughty, unpatriotic thought, probably. It would be interesting to see going forward, Chairperson, with the number of days without load shedding, to compare that with the burning of diesel. You know, is there no burning of diesel at the back end compared to, I don't know how to put it. This is South Africa. We've seen a lot behind the scenes. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Boyson. I now see Member Walters.
Really just a question of clarity in terms of the leap versus no leap page there. It looks like it looks like the patrolling types of things, the things that happens in a community, the kind of visible policing types of items or decreases are there, and it looks like there's a link between murder and the drug economy. So I'm not, perhaps you can't answer the question, but that looks like the key driver of that is a gangsterism and the drug economy. Would that be a correct assumption to make?
Thank you, Member Walters. I now see Member Stoffel. Please go ahead, Member.
Thank you, Chairperson. Chairperson, let me welcome the presentation, MEC. The first one is only a comment or a request to the committee. When we deal with these issues within the committee, I think it's very important that we have figures instead of percentage, so that we know what we are dealing with. It's very difficult to respond to a percentage that you don't know where does it emanate from. Maybe it's a cross-reference. There's a need for a cross-reference when we are dealing with percentage versus the total allocated for that specific. And then the second one is that I've noted you have indicated that unfortunately there's no numbers on the pages. I will then read the heading, Unemployment Trend and Insights. I have noted that you are writing there, Western Cape display a unique unemployment pattern. And I think we are dealing here with economical growth and development and all those kind of things. So looking into what you have raised, and then there was a request from Beaufort West, from the member of Beaufort West, to say, I think there's a need for a breakdown here when we deal with these things. We cannot just say it's a unique unemployment pattern. Where? We must know where is this pattern and what is the contribution of that pattern in that specific area. And then we must also check to say, in this development, economical development that we are talking here, how does we balance this economic? Because here I've read that they are saying Cape Metro unemployment rate is 26 higher than the rural districts. You are mentioning that. But practicality doesn't say that. Practicality doesn't say that. Because I arrived, let's say I was born 20 years back. Then you look into the area where I'm staying in the rural districts that we are talking here. The area is still the same. The building that was standing there, it's still the way it was. There's nothing new in the area. Now you take that one versus the metro, except for people who's coming to the metro. Except for the people who's coming to the metro, what else is there? And what else is there for that rural? Hence, I agree with member to say there is a need for this breakdown so that we can see where was this development, or where is development, or try to develop, or whatever you can call it. And even within that unemployment or employment percentage that they were mentioning, the breakdown, how many, I don't want to use this term, but how many colors, how many people is being employed under that development. I think we need more breakdown in these things than just a percentage. But otherwise than that, I appreciate the presentation.
Thank you for your valuable inputs, Member Stoffel. We have noted your inputs, and we will definitely ensure that they are added to the resolutions as well. I think it's a very important point raised by you and Member Constable, but over to you, MEC and HOD.
Thank you so much. Just on the district level information. So previously we used to table the provincial outlook and the municipal outlook together. But what we found was, because the provincial budget process has a different timeline to the municipal budget process, it was actually more useful tabling the municipal economic review and outlook a little bit later in the year, so that when Provincial Treasury engages with the respective municipalities or the respective districts, that is more useful for them in their particular process. But if the committee wants, there is an opportunity for us to change it back, because previously you would get your district and municipal level matters at the same time, the data at the same time as the provincial. But the change came from the municipalities being that maybe the information is more useful if we table it in line with their budget process and not in line with our budget process. So there are some figures in the book, for example, that refer to districts, and there are some that not. Some examples of these are on page 70, that deals with district level of the economically active population. Another example is page 78, that deals with formal, informal employee percentage split. Another example is page 81, dealing with the expanded, sorry, not 81, it was the other one. 87, that dealt with the unemployment rate as a percentage of the total population. You'll see the respective districts and the numbers. Some figures do only have figures or only have percentage. If there is something specific that you would like us to maybe forward to the committee, particular percentages or particular numbers that aren't in the book, we are happy to do so. We always try our best to make the book and to make the publication as useful for members as possible, because you are one of our key stakeholders in terms of this data and evidence, also informing lawmaking and oversight and public participation. So we can have a look at what particular figures you would like to see more of. But I must admit, those particular figures in terms of district and municipality, it comes in the municipal economic review and outlook. But we can have a conversation. We can also engage with municipalities at the end of this year when we table that, to find out whether this change in the process has been useful for the budgetary process, and if not, whether there's an opportunity for us to bring it back as to tabling together. Regarding the diesel, I'll ask the team if perhaps they know, but I do know at the Energy Council of the Premier, which we sit on as Provincial Treasury as well, is that despite the request from National NERSA, sorry, I can't remember the full breakdown of the name now, NERSA, is despite the request for increase in funding and the price of the tariffs that NERSA has been asking, that there's also been more energy in the system. So there has been quite a few questions from the Energy Council, from the province's side to Eskom in this regard. But I'm just going to ask that the team knows perhaps more on the diesel if we have that. And then there was just the leap versus no leap areas, if we can also deal with that.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to take Member Boyson's question in the manner in which it was posed. So maybe just to come back to the housing, I think Philip did respond, but I'm going to just again just maybe indicate in terms of the numbers. So the housing demand, Member Masipa, that was the question in real terms. It increased by 292,529. And at the same time, we've seen a reduction in the number for service sites. So the housing demand has increased, and we have the number there. But for service sites, that has reduced. You want to do the diesel one? Okay.
Member Boyson. The latest weekly performance update from Eskom indicate that it had spent 4.83 billion rand on diesel between April this year up to 19 September 2024, which is 71% less than the 16.75 billion over the same period last year. So there has been a significant saving in terms of diesel expenditure. But for the month of September, there has been an increase. You would have noted in the media that the nuclear power stations went down for a brief period. So both went down for a brief period.
In terms of the correlation between murders and drug-related crime, there's definitely a positive correlation, and it's plausible that there will be a link between drug-related crime and murder. So yeah, it's very plausible. And then on percentages versus figures, the reason why we use percentages typically is for one to make comparisons. If we say that the Central Karoo is growing at X GDP and the Metro at X, we can't make the comparison because the Cape Metro is so much bigger than the Central Karoo. If we only use figures, we wouldn't be able to compare it. That's the one reason. The other reason is quite user-friendly to use percentages instead of using the numbers. And then the percentages, it's difficult for readers to read the numbers, and then we have to add the percentages. And the last reason is basically for just providing perspective. If we say that the demand for housing increased by 292,000 people, I mean, it could be from a base of 1 million or 10 million. That makes a big difference. So that is typically why we tend to use percentages. Yeah, I think that all the questions are covered. Not sure if there's anything else.
Thank you. Members, third round of questions. I would just like to afford those who have not yet asked anything. If you have anything to ask, I'd just like to afford you the first opportunity. Does not seem that there are any. I see Member Nkondlu and Member Masipa and a third person. If there are any, not at this stage. Member Nkondlu, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chairperson. I think just sitting on the question on the understanding the unemployment trends in the province. I hear the response that says, yes, the Africans, what may be the driver. I'm not sure whether I'm understanding the response given, that the driver is many things, but what was mentioned is perhaps the low levels of education. I'm assuming that's what the answer is saying. I'm not going to say that is the answer. And when one looks at both, I think these slides on employment trends and unemployment trends, on one hand, I think on the other, it indicates that the cohort that saw the highest employment growth between 2019 and 24 were African, female, older age, and more educated cohorts. But also in the same vein, on the unemployment trends and insight, it says unemployment rate is highest amongst African population at 31.5% as per quarter 2, 2024. Now, I think what in a simplest way, one really wants to understand and make sense of is that when we consider the unemployment in the Western Cape and the racial profile thereof, what is clear according to this is that the Africans, particularly those that are less than secondary in terms of education, I'm assuming, is those that are more unemployed in terms of the data that is here. This is what I'm assuming it is saying. And therefore, if that is the case, Minister, one would be interested, and the data is very important. One would be interested. I'm not saying it's a question for today, because obviously we use this data, to understand the resource allocation trends in the province, where we put in money, when we look at budget. So surely, I think it would be interesting to bring back the very same data on how, when you allocate resources, whether this particular peculiarity is being addressed, with the programs in the province. And secondly, I think in the next slide, once again, I think I appreciate the lesson about what HDI is versus Gini coefficient. One appreciates very much. Thank you very much, colleagues, for the lesson. What one is further trying to understand over and above the lesson is that if you consider everything that is being said, and that's why I made reference to the speech of the minister. The speech of the minister, I think, in page 15 says, what do these figures tell us about the quality of life of the Western Cape residents? And then it goes on and on. The truth of the matter of what we're trying to understand here is that in this page, you say Western Cape population and poverty is growing, and that's a fact. And we see it when we do oversight work. But further, I think if you consider the lower bound poverty line that you mentioned here, has increased between 2013 and 2022, nearing 3.7 million people, significant spike in 2020 due to the economic impacts of COVID. So now what I'm trying to understand with my question, and pardon me when English fails me, I'm not, English is not my mother tongue. I would speak in Xhosa, perhaps I would be understood. What I'm trying to understand is that when you say the quality of life is improving, with the same vein and in the same statement, you say the Western Cape population and poverty is growing. How should, as an ordinary person, understand that message? So for me, it is confusing because on one hand, you are saying the quality of life is improving, but on the other hand, you are saying poverty is growing. So this is what I was trying to understand. That's why I'm saying thanks for the lesson about HDI and what it is. But try and reconcile the two statements so that one is able to understand them in a more simplified terms. Thanks.
Thank you, Member Mkondlu. Member Masipa.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, on page 19 of the PERO, it talks about the South Africa's urgent water infrastructure crisis, that South Africa needs about 1 trillion to repair and upgrade its deteriorating water infrastructure. I think the question is quite simple, is that what is the kind of budget that we need from this 1 trillion that is needed to repair the infrastructure across the country? What is the Western Cape's need from this 1 trillion? Do you have the figure? Can you share with us? And whether we also have the fiscus to be able to afford to do those repairs and so forth. Thanks, Chairperson.
Thank you, Member Masipa. Before I hand over to Provincial Treasury and the MEC, any other members for questions? I do not see any at this stage. Minister HOD, over to you.
Thank you so much. So I just quickly want to make a distinction between if there's been an increase in employment in a particular cohort and a percentage as a whole. So on page 67, we see the composition of, for example, South African narrow labor force. And on page 69, we see the composition for the Western Cape. So when we see there, for example, the figure of under race, for example, we see African 1.2 million. That increases then to 1.4 million in quarter 2 2024. So that change, that's the percentage change between what it was and what it is now. And that's just a little bit different to, okay, then what is the full percentage of the whole figure then now? But I'm just going to ask that on a just the technical, if we can just put those figures on the table there. And then just how do the Gini coefficient and HDI then technically speak to one another? So HDI has a lot of, let me just get back to that page quickly, has a lot of items dealing with education, attainment, life expectancy, average schooling years, and the standard of living in terms of gross national income per capita. Whereas Gini coefficient in some cases speak to sometimes if your income is very close to one another in a particular area, you might actually have a low Gini coefficient, but it might not necessarily mean people's income is above that particular poverty line. Whereas if you, for example, have low income and high income, the disparity of the different incomes is very large, but it is very possible in that particular area that even the lowest income might be above the poverty line. So I always, when I look at these various different metrics, I try my best to read them in context of one another, of GDP that deals a lot with economic growth and whether there's employment, reading in terms of Gini coefficient that deals a lot with income. Poverty line is, for example, how Stats SA and the respective institutions put as to what they consider as the minimum in terms of what how they define it, poverty. And I think they also define, I think it's severe poverty that they call it also. I'm not sure what the other wording is. And then HDI that specifically deals with quality of life, such as birth expectancy, life expectancy, education, and so on. But I'm just going to ask the team, just from a technical level, that how we read that in context with one another. I'm trying my best to put it in my layman's English, I guess, if I can put it in that manner. Yes, and just then the correlation between African and lower levels of education, and it was the water. Water. Perfect. Thank you.
Philip is taking his notes. Let's start with the water, through you, Chair. I think one would also be, I think for provincial budget, it needs to be aware of these risks, but we need to be mindful of what is our actual mandate. So the water competencies with the national department, and then obviously there is a shared responsibility from a municipal perspective. However, because we recognize it as a risk for this, I'm sharing now. We are still in process of developing the circular that we're about to send out. But because we've recognized it as a risk, we are taking a thematic approach to our MTech discussions, where we're looking at the broader impacts of climate change and disaster management. And part of that would include water as well as energy, so that we can begin to understand what would be perhaps some of the preventative measures that is not necessarily directly related to water itself, but to the impact of severe occurrences within the climate that would have an impact on how we respond from a provincial mandate perspective. But it's trying to look at it from a more holistic point of view. So that is certainly something that we are looking into at this particular point in time. Philip, if you can maybe deal with the rest.
Thank you, HOT. Yeah, the differences in unemployment, we've mentioned education is one factor, but another factor is basically the timing that and the growth in the labor force. Recently, the last 5 years, the African population grew by far the fastest in the labor force in the Western Cape. So if you grow the fastest, if your labor force grow the fastest at a time where growth is relatively low, then that labor force will not be absorbed into the employment opportunities, and therefore that population group specifically will see a growth in unemployment. So it's all about which population group grew the fastest at the time period where there were not strong growth. In terms of the quality of life, so there's various aspects that determine quality of life. HDI is actually a human development indicator. So if you've got high life expectancy, then we say it's a good quality of life. But how can we say that quality of life in the Western Cape improved? But remember, everything is relative. Even though the number of poor people increased, we must remember that the total population also increased. And if you look at the statistics, the portion of people under the poverty line actually declined in the Western Cape, which points to better quality of life overall. And then lastly, another thing that also impacts quality of life is then the Gini coefficient or income distribution. That we see there that the Western Cape also income distribution, it's distributed more evenly over time, which speaks to improved well-being for the overall population.
Thank you very much. Members, any final questions? I do not see any hands. That then concludes our discussions around the Pero. Thank you very much. We will now be briefed by Provincial Treasury that will present a high-level analysis on the fourth and the first quarter performance reports, whereafter we will take some questions from members. Over to you, HOD, to you and your team. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. It's it's between us and the Department of the Premier, and we will deal with both quarters in one sitting. I'm going to hand over to Ms. Pick. Chair, sorry.
Sorry, Chair, I just want to find out if our Pero people are allowed to be adjourned while the rest stay for the respective briefing.
Thank you for that, Minister. Thank you so much for joining us. You are welcome to leave this meeting now. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Chair. We will be doing it in one presentation in terms of Q4, and then we'll go straight into Q1, and then through you, Chair, we'll hand over back to you. So, firstly, in terms of setting the context on performance reporting, we're well aware this is the first report we're coming to the Budget Committee with. So we thought we'll give you some background on it, and also in terms of where this fits into the entire cycle in terms of the budgeting cycle. So in terms of some of the background, and seems like I'm now going to echo with less people in the room. But in terms of the background on quarterly reporting, the first thing in terms of the information that we're presenting to you, the high-level presentation we're making to you today, this is in terms of verified and signed off by accounting officers. The detail of that lies below this presentation has also been sent through a couple of days before today. And so therefore that is one of the reasons why we're saying that this is a high level, because the detail is with the Budget Committee. The quarterly performance report also then represents in terms of the budget and the annual performance plan, the APPs, the implementation thereof in a particular financial year. It allows in terms of for oversight, the Budget Committee both from an aggregate perspective, but then it also provides in terms of some insight in terms of what is happening in particular votes, or in terms of where particular votes are in terms of that quarter of reporting is in terms of, let's say, in terms of there's some risks perhaps associated with the reporting, or there's a particular outlier that we will also then indicate. Main reason for us in the Western Cape that I can say to you, this performance reporting as well as the financial reporting is one of the key for us tools that we use in terms of maintaining fiscal discipline. So the discipline actually doesn't only go in terms of the verification of information, the discipline actually goes to a particular time. So we have a track record in this province that in terms of the PFMA indicates in terms of when accounting officers are supposed to report to the Provincial Treasury, and we have a track record, and when we have to report to the National Treasury on our outcome as a province per quarter. And we have a track record where we have not missed that deadline. So it's not in terms of just the numbers in terms of reporting to you, but it's the actual governance processes behind that actually drives the fiscal discipline within our province. The other one I want to indicate to you is that the sharing of the provincial non-financial performance data per institution then is aligned to the provincial strategic plan, but it also allows you to give you some insight quarterly in terms of the socioeconomic environment. So just in terms of, again, to contextualize, we went through the PERO, and the PERO gives you socioeconomic data, and that's giving you data in terms of for the entire year. And it's also backward looking. What this, in terms of some of the information that will be presented to you per quarter, is where in terms of the Provincial Data Office of the Department of the Premier, they will look at a particular quarter, and that in terms of giving some insight is what's happening in the current financial year. Lastly, I indicated in terms of there's legislative requirements in terms of the PFMA, as well as the Public Service Act, in terms of which departments need to present this information to us that allows us then to give you the high level oversight of a particular quarter. So having said that, we're moving straight into Q4 then. And so Q4 also then represents, number one, it does represent, because it's a Q4, it represents the outcome of the previous financial year, of the 23-24 financial year, firstly. It also gives in terms of a kind of an insight into the annual reports. So the legislature goes into its oversight in terms of the first week of October on the annual reports, and this is giving you some flavor in terms of what those annual reports are going to be telling you, both from a financial perspective and then also from a performance perspective. where that's concerned. So in terms of the quarter four and the 23-24 financial year, I think we also need to understand the context in which these numbers or these expenditures has happened. So what was 23-24 like if we just cast our minds back? Well, firstly, I think we all remember the extreme weather over occurrences that we had. So that started in December 22 already, and then we had some in April, we had in June, and we had in July. And in terms of majority of that was in terms of declared disasters. So most of our departments from an infrastructure perspective was reprioritizing their budgets. Every time we had this weather phenomena, they were reprioritizing their budget. So we need to keep that in mind. Secondly, what you don't see necessarily behind the numbers, but in terms of what the year also represents, it's the first year that we, from a fiscal perspective, had to deal with, number one, fiscal consolidation. That means the provincial budgets were reduced. We also needed to do, for the first year, in-year reduction of conditional grants. And then also we needed to deal with, in this financial year, we also needed to deal with the cost of living funding from the national fiscus. In this particular year for 23-24, we were not funded for the full cost of living adjustments. So that is the context in which the behind the scenes, the numbers in terms of what represents. So when we dive into the numbers, what are the numbers telling us in that context? So we spent 99.1% of our budget in the previous financial year. That then means that there was a 0.8% in terms of 0.9% underspending, which equates to about 768 million rand. You'll see that the majority of the underspending then occurred in terms of health and wellness to the value of about 119 million, and then also in terms of the infrastructure department of 513 million rand. I also then need to indicate that this was the first year that we had the Department of Mobility as well as the Department of Infrastructure. So that's what 23-24 also represents for those departments. And that does in terms of impact, in terms of just in terms of processes, in terms of conforming as a department, and then also establish in terms of norms and standards within a department, also from not only from a governance perspective, but also from a service delivery perspective for those votes. On health and wellness, the 119 million rand underspending, that was mainly in terms of underspending on compensation of employees, but really driven by also an over expenditures in terms of goods and services, mainly because of the goods and services for health is in terms of driven by medical inflation, which is usually about 1.5% to 2% above inflation. And their baselines don't increase by those amounts, and therefore they always need to reprioritize within their budget. Therefore, in terms of some of the pressures, but having said that, there was 119 million rand underspending. In terms of Department of Infrastructure, the 513 million that I indicated, I must indicate to you that included in the 513 million was a reduction on the conditional grant of about 250 million rand. Of the 250 million that was reallocated to another province at the end of the financial year. When we're looking at the public entities on the next slide, public entities have spent 95.6% of their budget. With that means about just under 40 million rand underspending for all public entities, and you'll see that they have an adjusted budget of about 913 million rand. And the entities there is Westgrow in terms of, you'll see that there's an underspending of 15.3 million, and then also Western Cape Nature Conservation Board, or Cape Nature that they're also known as, is about 11.3 million rand. So in terms of when we're looking at Westgrow, they were planning in the 23-24 financial year to relocate the investor center office. That never happened in the financial year, so they never incurred that expenditure, and therefore that is one of the driving forces of the underspending to the value of 15 million. On Cape Nature, the 11 million that you see there in terms of underspending for the year. Mainly that is on goods and services, and that is in terms of delays in procurement on certain of the items that's required in the sector. It's protective clothing in terms of such as fire suits, and then also in terms of appointment on contractors in the areas in terms of natural source management, and then also in terms of integrated coastal management projects. When we're looking at infrastructure outcome for the year, we spent 94.2% of our budget. Here, I need to note, as I indicated to you as well, is the fact that there is in terms of a continuous reprioritization that needed to happen, obviously in terms of roads as that was affected by floods, but in terms of the weather conditions affected any of the and all of the infrastructure projects as we can as the numbers are also reflecting in the spending. So there you'll see in terms of underspending, in terms of transport in Cape Nature, there was some in terms of overspending in public works, and that is in terms of cleaning of the different spaces within our land that we actually own, and that is again because of weather. That means in terms of we needed to clean up a bit more in terms of our land that we own, and then in terms of human settlements, the delays there is in terms of community unrest, in terms of relocating of occupants. It took longer on different sites, and then also in terms of invasion on certain of the projects that obviously delays in terms of the rollout. On our own revenue in terms of this, so this is in terms of revenue that the province collects, so the departments collect. So for example, this is in health, is in our health patient fees, it's a motor vehicle license fees that's now collected by the Department of Mobility. And then also in terms of, it also includes right at the bottom of that table, it also includes in terms of tax receipts, taxes we collect in terms of from the gambling taxes. So overall there that you can see is the fact that we have over collected in terms of our revenue. And that over collection in terms of amounts to about 885 million rand in total in terms of the over collection. Just in terms of wrapping up on a financial perspective of Q4 and where departments then find ourselves, or where we find ourselves in the budget process right now. So we have underspendings as indicated in that first table by departments. We also have an over collection of revenue that is indicated by this table in terms of table 9. So what's going to happen then right now as part of the adjustments budget process, departments will apply to the provincial treasury for rollover of underspending, and there's some rules around that, and then also to retain some of the revenue that they collected that you can see in this sheet. They will start doing those kind of applications to us as a provincial treasury, with the final recommendations that the provincial treasury will make through the adjustments budget, which will then come to the budget committee, that you'll be able to see what of 23-24 we will then pull over into 24-25 financial year. On the non-financial information, that's where we're going now for Q4. I'm going to hand over to our colleagues in the Department of the Premier.
Thank you, Annelies. To complete our quarterly performance reporting for the previous financial year, we report on Q4 at this stage, and we'll progress to Q1 with the next reporting. So for Q4, departments and public entities achieved 86% of their quarterly targets, and it was fairly consistent with the Q3 performance reporting. Departments reported against 697 targets and public entities against 122 targets. On overview, departments achieved 87% of their set targets, 9% was partially achieved, and 4% was not achieved. The governance cluster within departmental space also achieved the best performance at 95%. For public entities, they achieved 81% of their targets, partially achieved 11, and 8 were not achieved. 4 of these 10 public entities also achieved 100% of their targets. And for public entities, also the governance cluster achieved 88%. Next slide. Okay, this slide provides the average performance of departments per quarter across the 23-24 financial year, the previous financial year. 8 of our departments achieved more than or equal to the provincial average of 87%, and 5 departments achieved less than the provincial average. Some reasons that were provided by departments for the achievement or slight underachievements were mostly demand-driven indicators, where achievements are linked to the requirements of our citizens. So the targets are not always fairly achievable. And then also dependencies on stakeholders and some budget constraints. Next slide. So on the public entities, the same. It's a view of the quarterly performance per quarter for the 4 quarters for 23-24 financial year. And then for quarter 4, the quarterly performance of public entities for 23-24 reveals that the provincial average was 81% for public entities. 6 public entities achieved more than or equal to the average, and 4 of these entities achieved less than the provincial average. Some key factors that contributed to the 4 entities not achieving full achievement was also demand-driven indicators and some dependencies on stakeholders. Next slide. Okay, unlike the previous quarters that we've reported, this quarter shares is based on non-financial data related to the implementation of our provincial strategic plan. We're bringing our data closer to that implementation. Firstly, report on some outcomes as they relate to provincial priorities. We then share a few key highlights from the institutions in the Western Cape, departments of public entities, as examples of delivery that they've achieved against these provincial priorities. I think it's important to note that these are simply key highlights. We did share in our release a detailed list of all the achievements of the departments that can be perused in more detail. So in terms of growth and jobs, we have for quarter 4 provincial GDP increase of 0.30%. A number of people unemployed increased by 0.1%, with the unemployment rate for quarter 4 as 20.3%. And then compared with the 2% of the previous quarter 3. To increase the use of our data, as explained, we also now include the provincial achievements of departments. I've listed all of them there. That's key achievements. I don't think we're going to go through each one in detail, but it provides a view of 10 institutions where we shared their deliveries for quarter 4. Next slide. Okay, also on the well-being priority, the HIV had a positive rate of for 15 to 24-year-olds was recorded as 1.4% for quarter 4, lower than the 1.5% target. In the 4th quarter, 15.2% of children born in government facilities weighed under 2,500 grams, below the quarterly rate of 17.1%. This means fewer children have been born with an increased risk of being stunted than expected for quarter 4. On the right-hand table, we also share some key performances from our institutions. Education with the 99.3% school governing bodies that met the minimum criteria in terms of government facilities, and also 50 schools have had local area networks. On the health department, the satisfaction rate of patient experience of care was approximately 84%. In addition to the 72.3% of TB clients also successfully completed the DSTB treatment. Social development also had 11,872 older persons benefiting from subsidies that were transferred to community-based care and support services. And then 16,560 people were provided with meals at departmental funded sites. Next slide. Okay, in terms of safety, the homicide data for Q4 marked a 25% increase compared to the same period last year, but a 15% decrease compared to the Q3 data for 23-24. The 13 metro priority areas or LEAP stations recorded 565 homicides in this Q4, marking a 34% increase compared to the same period in the past. There was also a recording of 39% decrease in the number of homicides. The provincial areas, excluding the LEAP stations, and the rural priority areas recorded a 22% increase compared to the same period last year. For Q4, a total of 2,269 sexual assault presentations at our public healthcare facilities were recorded, representing a 20% increase compared to the same period last year, and a 5% decrease compared to the previous Q3 reporting. We also list and share 5 institutions that had initiatives implemented during Q4 on the Department of Police Oversight and Community Safety, reported that LEAP officers conducted 2,017 arrests targeting drivers of crime. There were 32 LEAP integrated operations in support of rural safety conducted in Overstand, Mossel Bay and Swartland. And similarly, 32 K9 integration operations were conducted in the same areas. For the Department of Health, we also had approximately 97% of patient safety incidents cases closed, as well as 71 severity assessment code SAC 1 incidents were reported within that district. Social development reported 13 human trafficking victims and their children access shelter services and safety environments, and 168 subsidized beds in funded patient treatment centers were supported as part of the provincial substance abuse strategy. Next slide. On provincial performance Q1. Okay.
Chair, through you, would you like us to stop there because that was Q4, or would you like us to continue to go on to Q1 for the current financial year?
Thank you, Ms. Speaker. I think we should perhaps deal with the first presentation before it gets too confusing with all the page numbers, if that is fine with everyone. I would like to ask members that when you pose questions, please refer to the slide number. I think it will just make it easier for everyone. I see Member van Wyk. I see Member van Minnen and Member Masipa. And then the next round, I'll come to Member Nkondlu and Stoffel. So in that order, Member van Wyk, van Minnen and Masipa. Please go ahead, Member van Wyk.
Thanks, thanks, Chair. I think just possibly for education too of the committee and the members. On the provincial expenditure, we've got one line there that's transfers, or one column transfers and subsidies that come in as part of that spending. We've got the cost of employment, the goods and services, and then transfers, which are probably the third biggest. If you could perhaps just give a brief oversight, just that members understand that. And then when we're dealing with public entities, the public entity budget, that is in addition, I'm assuming, to the provincial expenditure to the various departments that we're doing that. So that just takes us to that overall budget. I think those are probably my main questions that I have right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Member van Wyk. Member van Minnen, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I don't want to start picking out a whole number of departments, so I'm going to try to do it as a relatively sort of general question. Starting on page 12 with the average performance. Is there any particular reason why the 4 quarterlies differ so much and there isn't any kind of uniformity in that regard? So say if you look at Q3 with .P that is much lower. Well, it's significantly lower than the others. But if you look across the board, you really do see some lack of continuity or consistency there. And then this stretches over several slides, and I realize that orally you've done an update, but the problem is starting here with slide 14, talking about the socioeconomic picture, and that goes on for several pages. There's no comparative. I mean, there is with, say, for example, safety, but in general, there's no comparative. And also, I want to ask about follow-up. So one talks about bursaries on slide 14. Bursaries are awarded, participants are trained. Is there any follow-up as to what that results in? Or is it simply that the bursary is awarded and then there's nothing coming out of that? On 15, that is a very good example of what do the stats mean quarter on quarter, as it were? Are there increases? Are there decreases? Is there a particular reason for that? These figures need to be contextualized. So I'd really appreciate anything you can say there. And then lastly, with safety, where one does have some contextualization, is one able to isolate policing figures where they are dependent upon proactive policing, for example, roadblocks with drink driving? Because it's good and well to say there were X, but what also needs to know, is that a result of more police action or is it something that they've picked up? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Member van Minnen. Member Masipa, please go ahead. You were the third.
Thank you, Chair. I must first congratulate Minister. They say new broom sweeps clean. I see you already given us a surplus budget of 885 million this province. So congratulations with the gambling tax that you collected. So well done on that one. The questions, clarity-seeking question really is relating to the jobs, the unemployment. So the fourth quarter was 20.3% in terms of the unemployment. Now the second quarter now that we have got of 2024, it says that unemployment in the Western Cape is 20.2%. So we saw a growth of, is that correct? I think that's the question and the minister answered. So I think my question is covered. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Masipa. HOD, over to you and your team. I'm not sure who must speak. You please go ahead. Thank you. Sorry, Minister.
Sorry, I just want to make one comment. While I appreciate the compliment, quarter four ended with my predecessor, so I will relay the compliment to her.
Thank you, Minister. Seasoned politician, yes. So please go ahead.
Point of order, Chair.
Isn't important.
All right, thank you, Chair. I'm going to handle the questions on the financial side, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues for the performance information. So the question is really on transfers on that slide 5. That the member was referring to, and the different columns in terms of making up the total expenditure, one of them being the transfers and subsidies column that was mentioned. So I'll go through in terms of what kind of expenditures and to whom and which entities those expenditures are made up of. So in terms of, let's say, the first, from a governance perspective, the first 4 departments that falls under the governance section, you'll see that there's 139 million in terms of by the Department of Local Government. So that is in terms of transfers they are making to the different municipalities in terms of for different projects that they are working with the municipality on. When we're moving in terms of education, you'll see that there's a transfers of about 3.8 billion rand. Now that represents in terms of norms and standards that education make to schools. So this is in terms of various day-to-day maintenance, for example, and then the operations in terms of any of the security. They also included here in terms of municipal rates and taxes and so on. So that's that norms and standards components that they make to the various schools as a transfer to the schools. In terms of social development, for example, the 1.1 billion that you see, those are the transfers that we make to NGOs. And in our province, in terms of the model that we adopt, where social development is concerned, is the fact that we utilize NGOs more than most of the other provinces from that perspective. The other big number that you see there, infrastructure. Now, I also mentioned that this is the first year, 23-24 was the first year that we had a Department of Infrastructure that consists of human settlements as a program. Now, those transfers that you see then therefore for the infrastructure department is human settlements transfers that are made in terms of to the city, but also in terms of to the various municipalities on housing projects. So that is in terms of mostly in terms of where the transfers are concerned. Then in terms of some of them there also, and because as you indicated, there is about 913 million rand on the public entities budget there. Now, in terms of our public entities, majority of our public entities are 3Cs, meaning that we fund majority of our public entities. And so what this represents is transfers that you will see in terms of transfers that you'll find in your departments, in terms of the Treasury, it makes transfers to the Gambling Board. In terms of the Liquor Authority, that's community safety. Also then moving to slide 5, you'll see of those that's in terms of under community safety, then you'll see in terms of, sorry, it's called police oversight and community safety. Part of their transfers that you have there is not only transfers for LEAP for the city, but also transfers for the Liquor Authority that they make. Economic development would make the transfers for the for the West Grow that you see. And then environmental affairs will also make the transfers to the Western Cape Nature Conservation Board or Cape Nature. So these are the transfers that is then made to our various public entities.
Thank you for the questions on non-financial. On the varying performance per quarter, in the beginning of the financial year, there's quite a slower start from departments and their ratings. These calculations are made against the total indicators. So I think the province sit with about 870 indicators per financial year. Example, educational report on 6 indicators, and at the end of the year, they will report on a majority of 65 indicators. We have details of that within the release that we share with the members for quarter 4, where they unpack the details of those indicators per quarter, how many indicators, which indicators, and also unique to the province, we also incorporate partially achieved, which is important because sometimes with departments you get 95% achievement, which is very close, and you can't discard as another achievement. So we also include that. Also bear in mind that these are quarterly performance reporting. We do proceed to a preliminary annual performance. So all of them add up to the annual target eventually. So the best way to look at this specific data will be looking at the annual report of departments, and currently the annual reports of departments have been shared, and that will give a clearer indication of how the achievements pan out across the quarters up to the annual target. So looking at the quarterly data, that is shared with the department. They have systems in place to visit underperformance. They also share that with the audit cluster audit committees, and we also in detail share that. So I think the detail for that will be within the release, if that's in order.
Thank you. Just to add on quickly on the general performance also, if you look at the numbers of indicators per quarter, you see that fluctuation. So it's also not the same set of indicators that's reported on every quarter. And then if you look at an extreme example, education, for example, would report on 5 indicators for the first quarter of 24-25, but the overall number is 55, which they report on mostly at the end of the year and stuff. So that also explains a lot of the variance. On the socioeconomic comparison, I think we try to do that. So what we're trying to do is just also instead of just saying, departments have achieved 80% of their targets and stuff, we're trying to put that in context of actually what's happening and things like that. I note your point on the context. I think it's mostly in the well-being one where we don't have, the quarterly comparison, but we'll rectify that as an improvement going forward. But if you look at our report quarter on quarter, you will see each quarters and things like that. So we will give an update on what the current quarter is and then add to that. So that contextualizes. But also we're very limited in terms of what we can report on. So we are reporting on what departments report as part of the APP monitoring. So the contextualization, especially with the department's data and stuff like that. So you asked about the bursaries, for example. So they only report on that. Obviously, within the department, there's a lot of other reporting which doesn't happen in the APP. So a bursary, firstly, like just contextualization, has the bursaries recipient finish the course and stuff because they drop out along the way, and then also what happens along the line. So that's a whole different data set which we don't maybe have access to. If it's specific questions, we can go back to departments and ask them on that. Just on the unemployment, so yes, 20.3 for the fourth quarter of 2023, but then you said 20.2 for quarter 2, which is the latest. It's actually 22.2. So the unemployment has actually increased from quarter 4. It actually increased to in quarter 1, and then again in quarter 2 to the unemployment rate is now 22.2. That's the latest figures from Status.
Final remark, sorry, Minister. On the evaluation of the implementation and how it impacts on the outcomes and the outputs of a provincial priority, for example, the bursaries. The lead group for that will also do rapid evaluation within their group to see what impact has been made, and they will also then adjust the achievements towards that and targets.
Chair, I just wanted to actually give a compliment to Dr. Ishmael in her absence, who usually leads the session. So some of the slides that you see in this presentation weren't previously here. So through the past 5 years in Budget Committee, something that I always appreciated about Dr. Ishmael's team is, as you find that if there's something more useful that we can do as Provincial Treasury or the Department of the Premier in terms of how we report to Budget Committee, or if you feel we can better put the comparisons in, or more information, or more comparisons, we're always open for suggestions, because we want the information to be useful. We want you to be able to use the information in the lead up to annual report, budgeting period, departments putting their strategies together. A good example is the team actually changed how they report on performance regarding partial and complete. Another wonderful adjustment that they made was these key indicators they started putting in based on what the outcome indicators in the APPs were and the performance indicators in the APP, putting it into context. And something that I would always, as a previous member, also implore is, as members, you actually have a lot of influence with departments in the run-up to their strategic planning and annual performance plans and so on, to ask, is this the target we want to achieve? Because the Auditor General also audits us against what the target is in departments that we want to achieve. So perhaps in some targets, maybe there are opportunities for us to do better and have better quality indicators in our respective reports. And I think the departments would actually welcome suggestions in that regard.
Thank you very much. In terms of the next round of questions, I have Member Nkondlu, Member Stoffel, and a third member, Member Windvogel. In that order, Member Nkondlu, you're welcome. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. In slide 7, just looking on spending, I just want to check whether there's a reason why in the explanatory notes, I think there's an explanation of the underspending, but not of the overspending, I think, of Heritage, Western Cape, and Casidra. This linked to my question also in the next page in slide 8. of public works overspending. And if one looks at it and calculates from what is the adjusted budget and the actual spending, it's almost about 65 million. I want to understand that where there is overspending, where do the actual department or even an entity draw the funding of that over expenditure? Because the reality, as stated here, what was the actual budget versus what was spent, there is that particular difference. So I'm trying to understand when then a department like Public Works, as is explained there, and the reasons thereof, they have overspent with almost 65 million. So where do they get the 65 million? Who would have approved that money, and what is the process of approving over expenditure from what was budgeted for? I'm hoping I see the minister and your team.
If you could just repeat the second number, we got the first one of.
Okay, I was saying the first one, I'm trying to understand why in page 7, we've got 101 over expenditure of Heritage Western Cape, Casidra at 102. And I'm saying in the notes, it is not explained, as we did in the next one. You only explain under expenditure, and one is interested in that. Now, I'm saying, therefore, I'm asking in Public Works specifically, it's showing there, and I think the amounts are there, between the 752 million versus the, I think it's the 686, if I'm not mistaken, and it shows 109.6%. Are we together? Yes. Yeah. So I'm trying to understand this 9.6% of the budget. Where did they get the money? Because that money was not budgeted for. There's money that's budgeted, then you overspend. Where do you get the money that you overspend with? How is that money allocated? Who approves, and the process thereof? So I'm interested just in the concept of overspending. So if you can explain that to me. And then I think this is a question one would normally ask on the what do you call it, performance indicators. I think this issue of partially achieved, not achieved, and achieved. Where do we calculate partially achieved? Do we count it, especially because this is Q4 at the end of the financial year? So do we then count as a performance of that particular quarter, not meaning the entire year? Do we, if we had to ask what was achieved versus by what was not achieved, that as an example, out of the 604, out of the 697 targets, those targets, which is 64 and 29, can we conclude that all of those were not achieved? Because if it's partial, it is clearly not achieved. The last one, I just want to check with the department in the issue of socio-economic picture through outcome indicators. An interesting point. Is it possible to actually provide either the baseline or the actual sample size? Because you see, if you say here in the report as an example, 1,559 bursaries were awarded. I do not know against what, If you say funded 2 infrastructure programs, I'm not sure against what. What were the infrastructure programs that were there or were planned, created 8,844. So I'm just asking, I'm hoping you understand my logic. Where that is, are we able to get what is the baseline or the sample size on which we are able to report this, especially because we're giving just a socio-economic impact of the work that was done during that particular quarter. So I think that is what I'm trying to understand by that question, if it's information that can be provided as part of this section. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Member Nkondlu. Member Stoffel, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chairperson. My point is only a point of clarity. Page 6, top. It reads as follows. Provincial expenditure at the end of March, amount of 81 billion. And then you go further. A net preliminary underspending of 7,068,000. Now, if you look into the key components for budgeting within this, the first one is health. And then you look into the health one in terms of the underspending, and the most underspending is under compensation. Now, within that, my clarity question is that why there is such a huge problem of not spending, or the spending is more about the compensation? Is that is it people that was on the system that was budgeted for that is no more in the system? And then second, on top of it, is it post, like vacancies? How did this thing exist? Why there is such within that department? Because we want to be clarified here. What are we dealing with? If it's vacancies, why the vacancies could not be filled? But if it's people that was on the system, it's understandable, which means that must, because the reason why I'm asking, health is one of the key components of government. It has to be prioritized. And if I look here in terms of the budget and the spending within that department, there's slight of a problem there. Because there's no way we can have a department that don't have enough employees, or a department, I'm assuming, whilst health is one of the critical pillars of government. So I think there we need more of an explanation. And then also, as much as they give us the explanations why these things, why there's a over expenditure or why there's a under spending, it's not enough reasons for that type of a department to have such. And then also the infrastructure. We are sitting here with 513 million. That's a lot of houses for people. And if you look into the reasons, so I want to check with the budget committee, with the panel to say, is there been timelines been given to that specific MECs to say to deal with this money? Because we are sitting in the Western Cape with the housing problem. Why we give to Limpopo as if we don't have a crisis of housing? So as a committee, I think we need to go deeper in this one, because this is unacceptable. As a committee, we can be witnessing this as a committee. Then it's a misconduct from us. So we have to deal with this, chairperson, this one. We have to deal with this one. And whether we have to deal in what way, but the committee should come up with something, and we must deal with this. And then also, my last, in terms of the departmental MECs, in terms of not spending and overspend, is there consequences for not spending? Is there consequences? And I just add on what Member Kondlo have asked to say, if even they go for overspending, where does this money come from? So I thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Member Stoffel. We had Member Windvogel as the third. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chair. Chair, mine is also on page 6 when it comes to health and wellness. I just wanted to check in respect of the overspending when it comes to goods and services for the Department of Health. And noting that this is an issue that occurs every year, what are the reasons and contributing factors to this overspending, and what is the government's response to it? Does it indicate the need for increased budget for health? And if that is the case, which healthcare facility contributed to this overspending? Also touching on the same page, I think Member Stoffel's touched on the underspending. The slide that's of the paragraph that speaks of underspending in the compensation of employees. Can we get clarity about this underspending? How did it occur? I ask this because on the one hand, the provincial government complains daily about the cost of living wage agreement, which puts pressure on its budget, and yet on the other hand, budget for compensation of pay is not fully spent, and it doesn't make sense. I don't understand what is happening. Can we please be clarified? Wherever you go to health facilities, staff shortage. Why is it like that? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Member. I will now hand over to the MEC, HOD.
Just on a general note for page 6, I think, Chair, we could probably put that in a little bit better of how the calculations get done. Because, for example, when we say net underspending, what we do is we take the overspending and we plus the underspending, and then you get your net, whether it's an overspend or an underspend. So I do think just in terms of how we write it, we can probably put it in a simpler language and how to do that. I do know on health specifically, what often happens is if medical inflation increases more than what you thought it was going to increase, you can't stop buying the plasters, you can't stop buying the needles, you still have to buy it. But now the cost of it has increased. So when it speaks to, for example, medical inflation, that's what something like that speaks to. The fuel prices, for example, is something that health doesn't control the fuel price. So also with estimations, if the fuel price increases more than what you think the fuel price might increase, then you're going to knock on Provincial Treasury's door to say, actually, we need a little bit more money. So that's, for example, the overspending. I'm just going to ask if we can maybe just unpack each of the respective categories for the underspending and overspending. And then you've also asked us on infrastructure also. Overspending, underspending. The baseline, so when you go to page 5, for example, in health, sorry, my nose is running. In health, for example, the total spending on health for the year was 99.6%. So very often you will see there might be a little bit between the 99 and the 100. So the underspending of health in totality there was 0.4%. Underspending, we usually work on the average that National Treasury gives us of 98. That please don't underspend more than that, because we want to get as close as possible to your budget. You want to get as close to 100% as possible, because when you overspend, you do also get into trouble with the Auditor General. But I'm going to just ask the department to give us some of that context of the overspending and what happens when departments come to us to say, we project overspending, now what? Yeah.
Oh, and this starts, maybe let me also appreciate the questions from the committee. I think it always assists us in sharpening our tools in how we present the information. I think, and maybe just in terms of the risk question, in relation to health, I think we as a provincial treasury and the department itself has been consistent in raising some of the pressures that they've been experiencing in the system. And how we ended off this year, that we are reporting onto the committee now, is with deeper. We've identified that as a risk together, and we've also acknowledged that. Given what we see in terms of the data, in terms of the increase in the service load pressure, we just had the Pero presentation. We know that the service load pressure and the demand for services is on the rise. It's increasing, and we also know that the allocations that we're making is unable, due to a number of factors, to keep up with the demand. And hence, both from a departmental perspective as well as from a treasury point of view, as well as provincial cabinet, there's an agreement that there's certain risk in the system that we need to deal with. So much so that I think one of Minister's first engagements with the Minister of Finance was in terms of raising both the risks that we see and that we're carrying from the end of the fourth quarter, how we ended off the financial year, in terms of the sectors that we do see that is under pressure. So that conversation is happening not only within the province but also at a national level. Maybe just to I think it's important that we put it in context. So although we see the underspending, especially for the Department of Health and Wellness, I think it's less than, if we do the calculations, less than 1% of the budget. There are some areas, I think, that Annelies will expand, and Michelle, in terms of the specific items. But overall, I think the overall, and that comes to the norm, and hence also the type of audit outcomes that the department has been able to achieve over time. But also maybe just to indicate, as departments would come through to the committee in terms of their own annual report, I think that also provides a golden opportunity for the committee to engage with some of the detail in terms of engaging the department in some of the issues that members are picking up in terms of what we are presenting here today. So I'm going to ask maybe Annelies and Michelle. Okay.
Let me go to slide 7. In terms of slide 7 was the CACIDRA indication of over expenditure, and then the next one is going to be over expenditure on public works. And if you don't mind, then I'll go in terms of what does the PFMA say about over expenditures, and from that, so I'll try and group them together rather, that hopefully together tells the story. So in terms of on the public entities, and that's the slide 7 that the member was pointing out. Now, one of the things that I need to indicate in terms of the outcome of quarter 4, the outcome of quarter 4 that we're showing you here is preliminary. The final outcome will be in the annual report of the departments that will come to the various standing committees. So in terms of, so what is indicated here in this public entity was indicating in terms of over expenditure. Now, public entities also have a different accounting system than the departments. So in terms of where they have in terms of accrual accounting, in terms of, so what that actually means is the fact that they take into consideration in terms of not only their actual expenditure, but also then in terms of the non-expenditure items. So depreciation, for example, is a non-expenditure item, but it comes up as expenditure, but it's not cash backed. If you understand. Mm-hmm. So then in terms of that kind of items in the preliminary outcomes will then in terms of show over expenditure, and then in the annual report the entities will show how they dealt with those over expenditures. So what I'm saying is that it's not necessarily cash as actual expenditure over expenditure. It is in terms of accrual accounting that the expenditures show in the preliminary stage of reporting. So that is in terms of where public entities are concerned, which is a different, again, I say it's a different accounting system than the cash-based system that the departments in terms of utilize. So now let's go into an example in terms of cash-based, which is public works on the infrastructure table, which is in terms of showing that the public works adds over expenditure about 9%, because that's 109% in terms of the total actual. So what the PFMA allows, and again, this is in terms of preliminary, the PFMA then allows, when the departments are putting the annual reports together, that the accounting officers are allowed to shift funding between programs. Now, Public Works is a program within the Department of Infrastructure. So then the accounting officers are then allowed to shift in terms of not more than 8% between programs at the end of a financial year. That will then show in the annual report. And so members will see then that that's where that actually happens. So it's underspending then on other programs that they're allowed then to shift to overspending in terms of, in this case, it would be in terms of public works. You have asked in terms of what kind of oversight that's indicated. Number one, there's rules around it in terms of the PFMA, what an accounting officer may or may not do. So, for example, it cannot use transfers, for example, in terms of when they're shifting funding. They cannot use compensation of employees, for example, when they're shifting funding. And then where there's in terms of an administrative oversight is that those kind of decisions that an accounting officer is making, that will then come to the provincial treasury to make sure that they are applying in terms of what the PFMA has indicated, and therefore finally show up now in the annual report that will come in the first week of October to the members. Then in terms of so then let me go for overspending in terms of what the PFMA says. So it's very clear, overspending in terms of the entire vote, if that is the overspending, which we've never had as a department, any department overspends. We don't have that in this province, but if that's unauthorized expenditure. And then that in terms of is reported here in terms of the House, it's reported in terms of the Auditor General, but then also in terms of from how do we make that good? Because in terms of for that to be done, so in terms of, and so now I have to say it's a theoretical practice that would happen in the province, is the fact that there would then need to be an appropriation bill for an unauthorized expenditure that would need to come to the House. Then in terms of the provincial treasury will then go about in terms of how to actually recoup that funding. So where do you then get the funding? So it either will have to come from the provincial revenue fund itself, or the provincial treasury could tell that department that on next year's budget or the following year's budget, we will recoup the money that you've overspent. So those are the options in terms of unauthorized expenditure. The reason why it doesn't happen on a vote specific for us as a province is because of a cash management system that we've put in place. So we only allow and give the departments the cash that we have budgeted for, and we do not give them any more cash than that. Therefore, they cannot overspend as an entire department. However, that they can be underspending like public works, responding to the flood as indicated on page 7, is in terms of the reason for the overspending is in terms of partly is in terms of like I've indicated in terms of cleaning Erwin and so on, and then also from that perspective. But on a program, then that program can be made good with what we refer to is in terms of vitamins or shifting of funds then between programs like I indicated. And like I said, that will be reported in the annual report. So I think I've dealt with those 3 questions. I wanting to come to let's just contextualize health. for example, and some information where health is concerned. So one of the important things, and I'm going to go to the information that's in front of the members. So if we go through the first table, for example, and that's table 5. And when we look at the total at the bottom and we look at COE, so you'll see that goods and services, and this is overall from a province perspective, of our budget, about 18.8 billion rand is goods and services. Health's budget of goods and services is 9.7 billion. So health has half of the province's goods and services budget. So I wanna make that point. In terms of contextualizing. Then secondly, I also want to contextualize that that's 190 now. I would agree. I mean, 119 not spending as services not delivered. But as part of departments also having at the end of a financial year, 119 million rand is in terms of a spending, in terms of probably it can be within 2 hours for health. Because you must remember, they actually have a budget of 29 billion rand. And so at the end of the financial year, there is, in terms of what a department needs to do, is to make sure that they don't go over, because if they do go over, we as a treasury are going to say, you don't have cash for it, so you need to come back within your budget. They have to actually, in terms of what we call close the floodgates at a particular time. So we also need to understand, as much as we say that the money represents services not delivered, it is also that in terms of we need to contextualize it in terms of it's the bigger budget that the department is facing. So let's then get to the point on goods and services and why I made the point that it's half of the goods and services budget. So in health, because what drives half of the province's goods and services budget is the kind of items on medicines, is the items in terms of the health laboratory services, for example, is in terms of medical for operational medical equipment, for example. Those are all expenditures that's driven outside of health control, meaning the increase year on year. So some of them is in terms of inflation, exchange rate, for example. The National Health Laboratory Services has its own costing that health doesn't have control over from that perspective. You can understand any patient that enters health, and this is why it's a driver for them, is the fact that any patient would need, in terms of having any laboratory work done, must go through the National Health Laboratory Service. So you can understand increase in patient means increasing that cost. And like I said, an increase year on year that they cannot control. And then when you look at this, and we call this non-negotiable spending for health. Health doesn't have it's what the patient requires. And so when the patient then actually, in terms of presents itself to health and they get into the health system, there isn't anything that a doctor can say, yeah, I'm not going to do this kind of test. So you'll have, in terms of expenditures that they need to incur, that they are now trying to say, well, you can't just run away with cost. You need to put in terms of what they call gates at this stage, in terms of to make sure that we try and stay within budget. But then overall, what does this actually mean? It means that if health's baseline is increasing by, in terms of an average for the last 3 years, of about 2.3%, these non-negotiable items are growing between 4.5 and 7%, some of them. So you can see that the goods and services budget plays in such a big role on what health's day-to-day decision-making is concerned. So then you look in terms of what is the other expenditure item, is saying if that is what they must control, then where else must they look at in terms of when that goes and overspend, where do they need to underspend? Like we said, we as the Treasury, we won't allow the department to overspend. So then they look at within COE. And so from a COE perspective, our health department has a different way in terms of how they budget for their COE. And that is in terms of approved post list, right? So I think in terms of the health committee would have heard what they call the APL, which is approved post list. So health indicates in terms of this is what the budget that they can afford. If this is the COE budget, they're going to say, well, that's only 95% of the COE we require, but we're going to stick within it. But now the goods and services gets out of control. Where do they need to reduce? They need to reduce within the COE to get the balance. So then what they look at, and as in terms of the slide actually indicates in terms of that last bullet, is where they need to recoup in terms of get the balance. And they say in terms of what they do is they delay the filling of funded posts. So in terms of at the end of the financial year, they look at where goods and services finds itself. In terms of the vacancies, they do not then start making in terms of decisions to make the rate at which they fill posts. They will do that slower. And then in terms of looking at the service delivery model in certain areas, they will also freeze posts in certain of the departments by the end of the financial year, and then relook at the COE modeling in terms of the new financial year. So it's a balancing act that health needs to do because they have runaway costs. And so in order to balance the entire system, where they look at COE to balance that. So that's why that statement that says, in terms of the net underspending, as Minister indicated, goods and services is showing an overspending. And in order to make some of that overspending good, they underspend on COE. Again, as the Treasury we're saying, that underspending does relate in terms of the late filling of posts of nurses and doctors, but there is no other item necessarily that health can utilize that is in terms of enough in the enough in the entire budget system to deal with the goods and services. We have been raising the goods and services issue within the health sector. It's not only in the Western Cape. The numbers that I'm indicating to you is in the entire health sector in terms of the non-negotiable spending items that is way higher than the baseline allocations that they've been getting. Then you need to take into consideration how I started this presentation is indicating to you that we also had budget cuts in the financial year. So it's not that they only deal, so they had to deal with two things. They had to deal with, number one, that increasing in terms of the spending, which can be a runaway fire for them, but also in here, they had to cut their budgets where that's concerned. And that is in terms of how they got the balancing act. I'm not sure if did I miss something? I explained the overspending, I think it was. And then I explained the public works as well. On the infrastructure in terms of the human settlements, that is going to show also in the annual report in terms of the underspending. And in terms of with the members indicating it is quite correct. There is in terms of some of the detail in terms of what we have provided is in terms of to be able to pick up in terms of which not only which projects that would have impacted. I'm now speaking about the human settlements one under infrastructure, the 513 million, but it will also then show in terms of its annual report where they need to indicate in terms of which projects that impacted. And then we're giving an overall on why, but they can give a bit more detail on which what is the impact per project.
Chair, on non-financial performance, there were questions around the baseline, the calculations, and detail of indicators. On this platform, we share the performance of the institution and not per indicator. There's a big volume of indicators if we have to do it that way. But the process of confirmation of the indicator targets, annual and quarterly, is in the annual performance plan approved and shared by each institution. So the details of the indicator is in the technical indicator description, why the indicator is there, how they've come to the target on an annual and a quarterly basis. And that also becomes our baseline when we take it into our domain for calculation. The Provincial Data Office maintains a very robust performance indicator framework for the province that has got all over 1,000 indicators in there with their annual targets, with their quarterly targets. These departments then report their performance in the electronic quarterly performance reporting system, which is a national system, in detail per indicator based on their targets and their achievements. We need to note that they only have 1 month after the end of a quarter to validate all that performance for the Auditor General, but also to confirm that they did achieve what they report on. And you do find cases where with regional office and bigger departments, it takes a bit longer than a month to get that data in to actually validate that by the accounting officer. Hence the partial achievement. The partial achievement becomes important when we report to the committee on this platform, because that might indicate that they are close to the completion. It is not completed. It could be that there are outstanding data, but that's on a quarterly basis. On an annual basis, and I come back to what Annelies indicated or confirmed, the annual report is key in the financial year. That confirms if they actually met their targets for the full year and the build-up in the quarters. So we do very detailed calculations within the indicator framework that we report to this platform and to Cabinet and also the Cluster Audit Committee. Details on that indicators are available, as mentioned, in the APP, and the institutions will be able to share those indicators with you and their performance on that. Also important to note is that tables in the release that we share with the committee, the release has got the details in table 1 and 2 and figures 11 and 14 in the release, where there's more details around the indicators that we share and how we bring them together, and also explanation on the calculation of achieved, partially achieved, and not achieved. To end off, achieved will be 100% and above, partially achieved will be 50%, and under 100% and not achieved will be under 50%. And those calculations are done in that indicator framework per indicator.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else from the officials that wanted to contribute to the Minister?
Chair, I just want to say that the full pack of the respective performance for all departments we sent through to the committee last week, Friday. So this particular presentation is really based on the information we've already sent through to the committee. So here you kind of see we try to give you a snapshot, but if there is more detail in the respective documentation sent through as well. And again, also the annual performance plans and report should also give much more information as well.
Thank you, Minister. That was sent out to the members of the committee. Before we move over to the last presentation, a final round of questions. Any members? Member Masipa, I saw you indicated earlier. Any of the other members? Member Boyson and anyone else? Member Stoffel. In that order, Member Masipa, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So I also respond to the call by the Minister to say if there is obviously, areas that you can assist us in terms of highlighting how the reporting can be. I do understand the questions that were asked by members, by colleagues, but if you go through slide 5, then you will see that the spending as at the end of 31st March 2024, the percentage is all above 98. However, what is important is that there are transfers and subsidies, and those transfers and subsidies, in my own opinion, is that they go into this entity that are reporting here on the next page. And then obviously, I think in terms of the reporting, the agriculture will report that their spending has been 98%, which include the amount that they have transferred to Casidra, and so on and so on, with other entities that have got, what you call the own entities as such. So I just thought that that might just help, maybe in future, just maybe to provide that snapshot that, the information contained here, the money has been transferred to these entities and these entities as they report, but the overall figure is contained here. So in terms of the performance target, they are at 99 or 98. None of them has gone over the budget from their own department. Thanks, Chair. I thought I'll just make that contribution. Maybe the Minister will use it for next reporting.
Thank you, Member Masipa. Member Boyson, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chairperson. Chairperson, once again, from me, it's just a comment with the questions being asked and the answers given. I understand as the Chairperson of Standing Committee of Health, I understand it much better now. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Member Boyson. Member Stoffel, over to you.
Thank you, Chairperson. Chairperson, I just want to make sure whether I have captured Madam correctly in terms of the underspending. She have by the underspending in terms of compensation. She have indicated it's because of the delay in appointing doctors and so forth. I just want to, through you, Chairperson, whether it's that the answer, and if that is the case, what was the delay? What caused the delay? Because we currently, as we speak, we are sitting with hospitals that don't have enough doctors. We are sitting with clinics that can't be open 24/7 or 8 hours because of staff. And here we are sitting with the underspending in terms of compensation. So I want to be clear. I want to. I don't want to fumble tomorrow when I have to answer people. I must be clear on what was the response. I thank you, Chair, through you.
Thank you, Member Stoffel. I do think that that Ms. Pick did explain the over and underspending quite in detail earlier. So with your permission, it's just a proposal that we put that in our resolution to request for more information, or would you prefer that we get more information on that during this meeting, which we can gladly do?
Yeah, there's either we can get more information or more clarity at a later stage, but we have to be answered on that.
Thank you, Member. I appreciate that. Before we move over to the officials, I think the first two members, it was just comments from members, which we appreciate. So if there are any further questions before we hand over to the officials, please feel free to ask them now. Anyone? Member Nkondlu, please go ahead.
Chair, let me join the chairperson of my committee. Hopefully, I'm not lobbying to sit on the other side. I'm still okay this side. You know, Chair, I appreciate the responses given, the technical detail given, especially around Q4 and how the data is represented. What is of worry for me is the fact that, you know, when we consider this and context, as the colleagues are saying, we are then referred to the annual report, which is going to take place, and it's a process of its own. And when we are here, we're expecting answers of Q4. Because you see, this particular approach is that when we get to Q1, we're going to be told that this is still the first quarter of the year, and therefore there is still, you know, so it becomes a perpetual cycle. I'm not sure how do we deal with that particular reality, because how departments get to report and account to us obviously will always be on a quarterly basis, and we need clarity as it relates to that particular quarter. Number two, I think hearing a mistake about the issue of compensation of employees, which I agree with Member Stoffel's. I think in this day and age, talking about, you know, delays in appointments of funded posts, whilst I'm still trying to understand. As much as you agree, I agree with you. She went to town to explain what's in goods and services, you know, making it up for in the. I'm not understanding what that means, because when all is said and done, it boils down to one simple thing. You are saying there's money that was put for compensation of employees, which is the employment of doctors and nurses that are not there in clinics, something that we know, and there is freezing of posts. So in literal terms, what does that mean from a service delivery point of view? So I'm hoping that colleagues, you know, as they are in the bureaucracy of the department and they are able to explain, you know, from an accounting point of view, they must also be wary of our own perspective of oversight and service delivery, because that's the question we need to be able to balance. How do you, as minister in the speech, was actually speaking about the issue of the teaching posts, because there's a budget cut, and the budget cut affects teaching posts that are being cut. So we can't be sitting and then accepting, on the other hand, we fight for budget cuts that leaves teachers out of jobs, but then we must accept, for some reasons, of explanation, technical explanation, that doctors' positions and nurses, were freezed and they were funded, because these were funded posts, and the report says these were funded posts, meaning that they were thought through, they are in the organogram, money was put aside for those particular posts. So I think, for me, that is just my comment, and I'm hoping that in this journey we'll get to be really educated, so that it's not like, members sitting on this side, we do not understand, what the responses are, because I want to move here having clarity about what is being said and what is written here. Because if what is written here is not necessarily the case, let the report also mention that. You can't say something and then you need somebody to explain and give almost a 15 to 20 minutes explanation, because members of the public do not necessarily have the benefit of sitting here and listen to all of that explanation. Thanks.
Thank you, Member Nkondlu. We will definitely add your concerns and Member Stoffel's to the resolutions, but I will afford the MEC and the HOD must speak, whoever would like to respond to any of the questions or comments. And if there's anything else further to the questions posed by Member Stoffel and Nkondlu that you would like to add to, please feel free to do so.
I think, thank you, Chair. Let me start, because I think that what the members are raising are valid issues, and maybe that's why they call us the bean counters. And so the question around the delay, I think from where we are sitting, what we were just trying to convey to the committee is that in terms of the reason for the delay, the best department that would be in a position to respond to that would be the department who is posting these numbers. So what we are saying, yes, that maybe in the next round we can come back and we will provide further detail. But I think where we are sitting, the from an accounting perspective and from a budgeting perspective, that is the response. That when we look at the numbers, we don't necessarily see any other way out for the department. Where there wasn't really any other item. If you have a pressure on goods and services, something needs to give. And in this case, it was compensation. And perhaps a deliberate decision not to proceed at the pace at which one would have filled the positions. Because I think what is important is that with every month also, and we see it in our budget, with every month with compensation that you delay, you cannot make up for that. So it is underspending. So I think and those are the decisions in a constrained fiscal environment. It's reality that one needs to grapple with. And unfortunately, I think from a PT perspective, the response we gave was from a budgeting and accounting view. And we actually do understand that perhaps the space for the department to maneuver was simply not there. But Chair, we've taken note, and if we need to dig a little deeper in terms of, unfortunately, I think if members would have similar issues now with the first quarter, I think if there is an ask that we maybe provide additional information, then we will definitely look at that when we come back.
Thank you, HOD. Minister?
Sorry, Chair, I'm just going through the documents that we sent through to the committee, and I do see in the Q4 document, which is 82 pages, that Health has indicated the respective reasons. And for example, on page 43, I'm reading here about the goods and services pressure stemming from the full commissioning of non-COVID-19 services, including addressing the backlog in theatre lists, general increase in patient numbers and patient acuity, increasing fuel prices, increased more complex service loads, increased municipal service tariffs, as well as increased expenditure on cleaning and security services. So what happens in the section on the Department of Health and Services, they do in this report that we submit to the committee last week go into much more detail. So what we could do is we could maybe do an extract in terms of these particular issues for the committee. I think it is difficult to sometimes go through all of the respective documentation, but we can definitely do an extract and try and see where we can help with more information.
Thank you for that, Minister. If there are no further questions, can we move over to the final presentation? I'll take that as a yes. Thank you.
So we're moving into Q1 for the current financial year 24-25. We're going to switch it up and we're going to start with the performance information firstly, and I will wrap up on the financial information. Thanks.
Thank you, Annelies. Yeah, for Q1 for the current financial year, our departments of public entities achieved 353 of their 454 targets, which escalates to 78%. Departments reported against a total of 380 targets, and the public entities against 74 indicators for this quarter. On a departmental overview, they've achieved 78% of their targets, 17% were partially achieved, and 5% were not achieved. One department achieved 100% in the first quarter for their targets. The governance cluster within that sector also achieved the highest achievement within those institutions. On public entities, 77% of their targets were achieved. 18% were partially achieved and 5% were not achieved. 4 of the 9 public entities achieved 100% of their targets. It's important to note that the Western Cape Culture Commission did not have any targets for Q1. And some of the reasons for underperformance included the demand-driven indicators as well as validation of performance that will probably come through in the second quarter. Next slide. On departmental performance, this slide shares an average performance of departments of 78% for Q1. 9 of the departments achieved more than or equal to the provincial average, and 4 departments achieved less than the provincial average that was set of 78%. Some key factors that contributed to the 4 departments and more unpacked within the release that we shared is demand-driven indicators and dependency on other stakeholders. Next slide. On public entities, same display of an average performance for public entities that is 77%. 6 of the public entities achieved more than or equal to the provincial average, and 3 entities achieved less than the provincial average. Some key factors of the 3 institutions that contributed to a lesser performance were delays in internal processes and dependencies on other stakeholders. Next slide. Also for Q1, we share a socioeconomic view or picture of the targets per thematic area within the provincial strategic plan. And some of this data has also been shared within the Pero presentation of Provincial Treasury. For Q1, the provincial GDP increased by 0.2%. A number of people unemployed for Q1 of 2024 increased by 21.4%. The latest data from Stats South Africa indicates that the unemployment rate has again increased in the second quarter to 22.2%. In terms of key performance highlights that we share on the right-hand side column, we share 8 institutions and also their contributions towards jobs and how they have contributed in Q1 with that based on performance indicators in APP and other data sources. Next slide. On safety, the homicide data is in this quarter marked a 21% increase compared to Q1 of 23-24, and a 4% increase compared to Q4 of 2023-24 previous financial year. The 30 metro priority areas or LEAP stations recorded 641 homicides in this quarter, marking a 36% increase compared to the same period last financial year. The 5 rural priority areas where ABTs had been established in the past recorded a 10% decrease in the number of homicides. The provincial areas, excluding the LEAP stations and rural priority areas, recorded a 10% increase compared to the same period last financial year. In this quarter, there were a total of 1,416 sexual assault presentations shared at public health care facilities, and this represents a 22% decrease compared to the same period of last year. We also share the initiatives from our seven institutions towards the safety priority, from Department of Health, Social Development, Department of Mobility, Agriculture, Infrastructure, and the Western Cape Language Liquor Authority, which is our public entity, as well as the Department of Health. Last slide. On well-being, in terms of outcome indicator related to well-being priority, the HIV positive rate for 15 to 24-year-olds for the first quarter was 1.34%, exactly meeting the target that was set. Testing and identification of HIV positive youth is vital to enable linkages to care. In the first quarter, 16.11% of children born in government facilities weighed under 2,500 grams, below the quarterly target of 16.5%. This means that the fewer children have been born with an increased risk of being stunted than expected during this quarter. We also shared, lastly, the 6 institutions that contributed for Q1 based on the initiatives. That's also unpacked in further detail within the release. Thank you.
All right, so when we look at Q1 for 24-25 of the financial outcomes for the quarter, and so firstly to indicate in that table, so when we look at the table in terms of, you'll see that there is to the main budget of 84 billion rand. You'll see there's adjustments column of about 2.8 million rand. That is not that we have passed an adjustments budget, as the budget committee will be well aware. We have not passed, but for reporting purposes, what we're showing there is the approval by the national departments of rollover that they've approved. And so we've now, so it's rollover from the previous financial year to this financial year. And so we're indicating what the approvals we've received thus far. And that's the value of 2.8 million rand. And so in terms of when we look at the spending of the 84 billion rand that we've spent, we spent 19.7 billion, which amounts to about 23.5% of the budget. As at the end of the quarter, 30th of June, we are then also indicating that in terms of the pressures that votes are showing, so they're showing projected at this stage, projected overspending to the value of 640 million rand. I'll go through some of the detail on some of the high level in terms of expenditures there, but I also need to indicate to the committee that this 640 million rand projected over expenditure does not indicate and does not include the pressure that health is indicated and reported to us post 30th of June. They reported in terms of for the current financial year, plus minus about a 400 million rand pressure that they are facing, but it's not included in this quarter of reporting. And so when we look at in terms of, so if we look in terms of, if we take that into a consideration, then the pressures that the province is currently facing then is around 1 billion rand because as I said, as of 30th of June, they did not report the 400 million, but post in July that they did report the 400 million rand pressure that they are showing. So in the detail, in terms of where that's concerned, is in terms of the next page, in terms of the next slide, in terms of 27. And so I also then indicated in terms of why I would be indicating to the committee in terms of that 2.8 million rand rollover on conditional grants. It's because of the Direct Charges Act. So as soon as that is approved, then it does mean on conditional grants that the departments can spend the money. So therefore, when the approval comes through, that they start spending immediately. I then looking at the third bullet then in terms of on slide 27, indicating therefore the 640 million projected over expenditure excludes the education 400 million rand pressure. When we look at in terms of the majority, in terms of what's making up of that projected over expenditure, we find health and wellness, the department there in terms of showing that there is a net over projection of about 503 million rand. And that is mainly in terms of driven by goods and services. And in terms of on goods and services, it is as indicated also in terms of the fourth quarters, in terms of the higher than inflation rates in terms of certain expenditures, the higher than the medical inflation rate. The department has in terms of how they're looking at in terms of mitigating in terms of some of these expenditures. As we saw that there was underspending in terms of the previous financial year, and there was also over collection of revenue for health. And that overcorrection, so if you remember, the underspending was about 119 million rand in Q4. And then in terms of the revenue side, there was an overcollection of about 55 million rand from a revenue perspective. And so one of the mitigations is, as I indicated when I ended off Q4, is that the department will then apply to the Treasury for rollover of those previous, of the underspending of the previous financial year towards the current over expenditures in this financial year. So that's partly of the mitigation. Then the department is also then looking at in terms of other cost saving measures in here, in terms of looking for certain efficiencies, but they're not only looking for efficiency to try and respond to the current financial year, because as we indicated that this is in terms of within what is facing the health sector. So they're looking for permanent efficiencies over time in order to do so and change the certain costs within their baseline. So some other things that they are doing in terms of when we were discussing with them in terms of, because we do in terms of have conversations with them in terms of where else are they looking. They're looking at enhancing their revenue, for example, their revenue strategy, so that they can collect more and be more efficient in the health patient fees collection, but also in terms of any funding that they can, as a sector, now come together in terms of looking at the road accident fund, because the majority of the revenue that's not paid is from the road accident fund. So then in terms of over expenditure, still I'm with on now slide 28 on the Department of the Premier, they're showing about 107 million rand overspending, and this is mainly due to the payment in terms of Microsoft licenses. The reason why in terms of the higher costs there is in terms of the exchange rate. If you remember, in terms of at one stage the exchange rate went to 19 rand to the dollar, and we pay in dollars in terms of our licenses to Microsoft. And so that has been in terms of an increase in terms of that expenditure compared to what was budgeted. And then there are in terms of increase in licenses, number of licenses that we need to pay. The department is then looking at with the various departments in terms of how to actually within the baselines of all the departments where IT services are an expenditure, in terms of having to look in terms of how to reduce that within the Department of the Premier. So it's not only looking within the Department of the Premier's vote, but also then looking at in terms of within all the other votes, how to look at mitigating that projected over expenditure at this stage. In the Department of Mobility, they are showing in terms of a projected over expenditure of 29 million at this stage, and that is really in terms of the cost, in terms of the integrated transport hub. cost, and that is in terms of their ICT projects. Mitigating there again is that they are applying for some of their revenue that they could over collected in the previous financial year. They're asking to, in terms of get approval in order to shift that to the current financial year to mitigate that over expenditure. I mentioned then the Department of Education that at the time of reporting did not report in terms of the pressure that they were facing in terms of the 400 million rand. That's the cost for the current financial year. And that is in terms of mainly in terms of what they're facing in terms of the fiscal consolidation that they faced in terms of the previous financial year and in the current over the 24 MTF. And as I indicated, they reported this in the month of July, and therefore going forward, this pressure will be shown in terms of education. Then moving along in terms of the provincial overview, as at 30th of June, we thought we'll give in terms of some kind of insight in terms of the different departments, in terms of how the expenditure actually in terms of is incurred. But this shows you kind of the delivery model that the department utilizes. So for example, the red there is the blue is COE spent. The red is goods and services spent. The capital is in terms of for the yellow that you can see. So of the actual expenditure, it shows you in terms of the delivery model where departments are using COE as the driving as the driver in terms of delivery of the service, or is it in terms of goods and services, for example, that's driving the cost of actual expenditure? So it's just in terms of a bit more insight in terms of actual expenditure. When we're facing the public entities, as of the 30th of June, you'll see that the 21.5% that is spent at this stage of the 875 million rand budget. The projected over expenditure there is in terms of Westgrow. If we cast our minds back to Q4, you'll remember that Westgrow had an underspending of about 15 million rand. And so what they applying, and if you remember, that was relocation that never happened in 23-24. The relocation is happening in 24-25, and therefore now they are applying then for that underspending to be rolled over to the current financial year to deal with the pressure that they are showing there. And then the spending on infrastructure at this stage. So spending on infrastructure as of 30th of June amounts to 17.3% of budget. It is the first quarter. And in terms of human settlements, there is in terms of the difference in the provincial year because municipalities still find themselves in the 23-24 financial year. And so in the first quarter, the spending is usually in terms of slow, especially when there is in terms of partnerships with municipalities. I also need to indicate that the expenditure for education year, or let me rather put it this way, the budget for education year for the current financial year excludes the approval that they received for BFI funding for the Rapid School Build program. And that will be taken up in the adjustments budget. So the rapid school building was also shown in terms of our slides on the PERO, in terms of trying to accelerate in terms of infrastructure delivery of schools. Lastly, ending up on the financial side, we're looking at the own revenue. And at this stage of the own revenue, we have collected in terms of where the departments have collected in terms of about 34% of the 642 million rand own revenue that they're collecting. And then from the gambling and the taxes, there we've collected already in terms of about 41% of our casino, 28% of our casino taxes and 57% of our horse racing taxes. So no risk in terms of from a revenue perspective for the over collection at this stage. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Members, questions? Please indicate if you have any questions to the department. Member Nkondlu, Member Lacker, and Member Masipa. Please go ahead, Member Nkondlu.
No, Chair, thank you for the presentation from the colleagues. I just want to understand, I think Ms. Thick would have mentioned the issue of rollovers. And am I understanding it clear that that particular rollover, when it comes to the new budget, it becomes over expenditure because then it's extra money? I'm trying to relate the issue of Westgro because you are explaining that the money for relocation, if I'm understanding, which was an under expenditure in quarter 4, comes now into quarter 1, and in quarter 1, I see it's over expenditure. Is that how I'm understanding it in terms of how it's accounted for in the quarter 1 budget of Westgro? I think I just want a clarity in that, in terms of how the information is presented, so that one gets to, appreciate its meaning. So I think that's just one thing that I wanted to understand. The second one, Chair, is that in terms of percentage spending, and I'm meaning now overall in that slide 26, since this is quarter 1, and therefore the percentage spent of the first quarter budget, I think varies, with the most being economic development at 27 point, actually not, I think the Premier at 34.7 and Provincial Parliament. I just want to understand, is there a particular, is there a particular percentage of the budget overall that you sort of measure all the departments in terms of quarter 1 of how much they should have spent their budget? Similar thing that is there with performance information. So I'm trying to understand whether there is that, and how do we interpret that in as far as the spending that is on page 32. So if you can just clarify me on that one. And then on page 29, these cost drivers that you have explained there, I'm actually, in a way, a bit shocked. What does it mean when the Premier's budget, has to do in this quarter, in the main, with goods and services, almost 75%, versus the others? Is it something that is worrying, or it changes per quarter depending what would have been, the pressure on the budget on that particular quarter? You see, so that one understand this in context, because when you just read it, it doesn't say anything. So if you can just explain to me that. Then the last one, I think, is on the performance information. And I think when one looks at the slide that you shared with us in quarter 4 versus the slides that are in quarter 1, one looks at the performance as an example of WCED. I'm not understanding what that means when, they've got, they're actually on 20% of the targets achieved, versus the rest of 80% is partially achieved. What is partially achieved? I think goes back to what we have said, and if you consider they are quarter 1 again in the last financial year, you would see that they were sitting at I think below 70%, as a department. But also, when I look and use the same lens, what is in quarter 4 slide 12 and what is in this quarter, and I'm not mixing, I'm just trying to make sense of the information for myself, that should we be worried particularly on the Department of Infrastructure? Because if you consider the Department of Infrastructure quarter 1, if you do year on year, quarter 1 of the last financial year and this quarter 1, and you look at the performance of the Department of Infrastructure, you would see in the last financial year, in their quarter 1, in terms of their targets, they only achieved below 30%. And now they are at around 40 something percent, and I'm saying on the Department of Infrastructure, understanding that there is huge money. We even have a Department of Infrastructure to consolidate. What does this tell us in terms of spending of this department and just its own health? Mine is about that in terms of the performance information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Member Nkondlu. Member Lekker, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I want to get an understanding on page 28 under mobility. With regards to revenue retention, whilst on the one hand, this has to be considered during the 2024 adjusted estimate process. I want to understand, how does one then over expense on something, whilst on the one hand they may still undergo a process of the adjusted estimate process. But to Chair, I want to get an understanding in relation to a rollover process. How does that speak to monies that have been prepared for or budgeted for something, and one has over expect to utilize those monies? I'm not sure if you understand me, because for me, a rollover has to do with a permission to utilize that money before you can use it. So how do you then exercise an over expenditure whilst you have not been granted permission to utilize such money? So I just want to get an understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Member. Member Masipa, you were third. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chairperson. I think the question really relates to, my first one will be on page 22 regarding the unemployment increase that is now standing at 21, but we know that it's at 22 now. I think the question is, which industry has shed more jobs in creating an increase in terms of unemployment? If you can share, if you've got the information. If you don't have, it's also fine. I think you must just direct us in terms of the department that could provide us with that information. That would be great. The second question is on page 26. I'm reading here, maybe I'm not getting it right. At the bottom, the footnote says, projected overspending of 640.70 million for the province, mainly related to health and wellness, which is 53 million. But then below it says premier projected overspending of 107. I wonder if this is 107 million or 107,000 on Microsoft. So just some clarity, because mainly it will probably be the premier, and then obviously the other being the wellness. The next one will be on page 26. Oh, sorry, I missed 23. Just a point on 23. Okay, on 23, just a question, because there are obviously indication of key interventions. The question that I have was that this 72 neighborhood watches structures, is their budget just allocated towards doing their duties, or do they get stipend as well in terms of really getting income from the structure of the department, police oversight? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, members. Minister HOD.
I'll just quickly start with some general comments. Just .P can maybe just come in also with the education non-performance, but I just quickly checked the documents that we sent through. On page 43, it speaks to the education targets of the documents. So education had 5 targets and 1 was achieved, the others not. And for example, even though I don't have all of the information, but At one, they had a number of public schools that had to be contacted electronically via email. And the reason for that particular performance, non-performance, was because it was dependent on the opening of schools, for example. But those are the type of answers they've been giving for why they didn't achieve those particular 4 targets. But maybe P can just give us some more information if they have on that regard. The parliament one specifically that is so high is because members left. There are some members that are not here today that are not members of the provincial parliament that have to be paid out. They have to be paid out in terms of gratuity, their pension, stuff like that. So the increase in money is you have to pay it now. You can't pay it over the 4 quarters in the financial year, essentially. So as members and executives change, you have to pay it out. And then just with the Microsoft license, you guys can come in. But Microsoft license is why it's so high is you pay it once off. You don't pay it over 4 you pay it once off. And it's also subject to the rand-dollar exchange rate. So when the rand-dollar exchange rate, changes, we sit up at night and we're like, the price of it is going to change. And it's similar to medical inflation. So if the inflation changes, you kind of sit up thinking, actually, the goods and services is going to change on that particular item. But just more detail, the team will be able to assist us with. Thanks.
All right, so I think let me start off in terms of the question was in terms of Westgrow. That's where I'm going to kick off, and so that we can understand in terms of how things are happening. So at the end of the quarter, as we indicated on that slide 7, there is an underspending by Westgrow of about 15 million rand. They indicated that they were planning and they budgeted for the relocation of, sorry, I just need to check in terms of the investor center. So there was in terms of, so they budgeted for that cost. The relocation never happened. Therefore, because the expenditure never happened, therefore there's the underspending at the end of the 23-24 financial year in quarter 4. So there's underspending. Then there's a process in terms of the underspending and also in terms of the over collection of revenue that both public entities and departments can then apply in terms of to utilize that underspending. And when the approval is given and the Treasury makes a recommendation and the approval comes through the adjustments budget. If it is approved, then it will come through the adjustments budget. And then in terms of that will then be in terms of then a plus in the next financial year. So only after the adjustments budget do whatever the rollover amount that is approved, then it gets added to the 24-25's main budget. So that hasn't happened as yet in terms of that approval. We do know that we haven't had an adjustments budget, but what they are indicating to us as a department, as Westgrow is saying in terms of, but that expenditure is going to happen in 24-25. And when that happens, therefore, when they incur that and they do not get approval, it will be over an expenditure. That's why right now they're showing it's a projected over expenditure. If they do not get the approval for the rollover, then it becomes in terms of will it be an over expenditure. So I can see into the members' eyes, maybe I've lost. And I apologize from my side. Let me then start from another way. The rollover and revenue retention that they will ask for, like I said, from underspendings of the previous financial year, that hasn't been finalized. So that's a process on its own. Now they start incurring expenditure in the current financial year. They have actual expenditure, but what they also show us is in terms of projected expenditure for the other quarters. And what they're saying in terms of in the other quarters, when they must now incur that relocation costs because it's not in the budget for the current financial year. So if they must incur those costs, then they will show a potential overspending. And therefore, in terms of, that's why they apply then for rollover, because when that gets added to the main budget, then it will no longer be an over expenditure. That's why we speak about projected or potential over expenditure. It's not over expenditure as of right now. They're only indicating in the outer quarters if they must incur that relocation cost because they didn't budget for it in this financial year, which we do now. So I think I'm also then trying to answer then the question in terms of from rollover and so on. So when we're in quarter one, in quarter four, underspending of this underspending of funds. What they need to go through, both departments and public entities, they need to apply in terms of and certain rules in terms of when they can do rollover. So it is not that, for example, they can't roll over. I mentioned this before. You can't roll over COE for underspending, for example, or you can't roll over in terms of some of the other expenditure items like transfer payments. You can't roll over that. So we go through some of the rules. And then in terms of when we come to the House, in terms of some of the recommendations that we make in the adjustments budget, you will see what is rollover from the previous financial year and what is revenue from the previous financial year. And then when that is approved in the House, it's then added to the main budget. Microsoft licenses, and I think it was on slide, sorry, now just let me page there. I think it was the Microsoft licenses, and I think it's in slide 29. Now, this is a new slide. We were trying to see in terms of if we could give the members some of the detail is in the documents we provided last week, but here we're trying to just give you some of the actual expenditure that was incurred for the quarter. What was it spent on? So was it spent on goods and services? Was it spent on COE? What was it spent on? And that's why I was indicating. So let me use in the Department of the Premier, for example, and you'll see then in terms of the red. Now the red represents in terms of the scale, the red is in terms of goods and services. Now what is included in here is the Microsoft license in terms of payments, and therefore that's a once-off, and therefore for that quarter, the majority of funding or the majority of the expenditure was then on goods and services because it's a once-off. And that's why you'll see in terms of it becomes an outlier. But what the department is saying is that they did not have necessarily the full budget for Microsoft license because of the change in the exchange rate, and there's additional software licenses that they needed to purchase. And that's why they're showing the over expenditure at the end of the financial year.
On non-financial performance, specifically education and infrastructure. Again, I've got to refer to the release that we issued or shared with the committee. Annex A within that release shares the indicators, which indicators they are, as well as the comments that departments have shared on the reasons for underperformance. I think with education, it's important to note, as I've mentioned earlier, they only report on 5 of the indicators on a quarterly basis, and the remainder 52 at the end of the year. So their performance on a quarterly basis is very difficult to pin on their achievement as an institution based on the fact that they've got annual targets that they report on, mostly in the annual report or in the last quarter of a financial year. So for the quarter in question, they reported on 10% of the indicators that they've got in the APP. On the infrastructure, again, they reported for this quarter under vote 10, 26 indicators out of a total of 44. The 44 is then also spread across different quarters depending on how the targets have been approved by Cabinet as well as the department's delivery plans. They also in Annex A list the 15 indicators in question by number and by title, as well as with each indicator, the comments on underperformance that can be referenced.
Just going back to the unemployment rate increasing, just some information. I've just quickly accessed that. The sectors that had the most job losses between quarter 1 and quarter 2, so going on the latest information, 53,000 less people employed in the agriculture sector. And then in terms of the construction sector, another 28,000 people less employed there compared to the previous quarter. And the other big contributor was in the trade sector, which also had another 28,000 less people employed than the previous quarter. And then the trade sector, as well as the the construction sector, actually big employers overall. So you have to look at it like that also.
Sorry, just the one last question was regarding how we got to the 640 million. So on page 26, what you'll see is when we take the pressure that Premier shows, the pressure that, for example, health and wellness shows and mobility shows, that all adds up to the 640. So when we write there the projected overspending, mainly related to, what we mean is of that amount, this relates to the respective departments. I hope this assists.
Minister, maybe through you, Chair, and it is 107 million.
Thank you very much. Members, final round of questions before we end this meeting. I do not see any at this stage. Minister, HOD, all officials, thank you so much for attending today's meeting. I think you might still find some tea outside, so please help yourself, drive safe, and we will see you tomorrow, I guess, the Provincial Treasury Finance. Thank you. I have some administrative issues to sort out within 5 minutes, so please do not leave, members, but the officials and the minister, you are more than welcome to go. Thank you.
Hey. Bayavuya bacinga uba baze kokwabo apha kokwabo apha. Yho, Thixo.
Thank you, members. Members, if we can please conclude the meeting, we will be done within 5 minutes. The fourth point on the agenda is just the adoption of a draft committee report on the Provincial Economic Review and Outlook. Mr. Davids will flight the report on the screen, but I will read it to you. It just says, a report of the Budget Committee on the Western Cape Government Provincial Economic Review and Outlook 2024, dated Thursday, 26 September, as follows. The Budget Committee report that it convened on the 26th of September 2024 and has concluded its deliberation on the Western Cape Government Provincial Economic Review and Outlook 2024, referred to in accordance with Standing Rule 92 of the Western Cape Provincial Parliament. If I can just have a proposer from the permanent members of the committee, I would appreciate it. Member Wessels, and someone to second. Member Masipa, thank you so much. We then move to 2.5, consideration and adoption of the draft committee meeting held on the 18th of September 2024. We have sent out the minutes to all the members of the committee. We will flight it on the screen just now. It was the presentation that was done by the FFC. Included in the minutes, you will find the resolutions and the actions as well. About it. Yes, please go for it, Mr. David.
Thank you, Chairperson. Through you, members. So if I can just make this minutes bigger. As you are all familiar with the format of the parliamentary minutes, members. So we have all the members that were present, and all the members were present. We just had one apology from member Masipa. And then we basically go to the welcome and apologies. There was an apology from Masipa, including the chairperson of the FFC, Dr. Patience Mbaba. And then chairperson, point number 2, Chair, if I can just make it a little bit bigger. Point number 2 is basically just where the committee engaged the FFC on the division of the revenue, chairperson. So that was the engagement. Point number 3 basically highlights that the committee adopted the minutes of the 15th of July, 2024, Chair. And then chairperson number 4 is just the resolutions and actions that was captured during the meeting, chairperson, by the secretariat and through what the members have indicated. One of it has been the concern that the committee engaged the FFC on a quarterly basis to interrogate it or to engage it on the different chapters that it presented to the committee. So that will be done on a quarterly basis, Chair. The FFC, one of the members brought up the issue about the public health inefficiency and the district health sectors in South Africa in terms of the shortages and the exodus of healthcare workers. I think that was Member Stoffels. And then the FFC, point 4.3, the FFC brief and engage the committee on the infrastructure challenges of the small-scale farmers. That was Member Wessels and Member Mare. And then the FFC also on its relationship and interactions with the national and provincial ministries of finance. How do they interact and come to agreements, including that of the municipal sphere? That was also highlighted by Member Wessels. And then basically as well, chairperson, is just that the FFC submitted a report to the committee on the findings of the work culture and on the work culture of the within the municipalities in the Western Cape, including that of Salga, chairperson. So that was the resolutions and the request for information that was captured, chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. David. Can I please have a proposer for the adoption of the minutes? Thank you, Member Stoffel, and someone to second. Member Wessels, thank you so much. The last point on our agenda is that the committee adopt recommendations for further actions with regards to today's committee meeting. Mr. Davids did note some of the resolutions throughout today's meeting, and we will give him the opportunity to just briefly read through some of the resolutions that he took note of, and then we can just at the end of his presentation or after he's read the resolutions, we can just either add or remove whatever the committee proposed to do. Thank you.
Chairperson, thank you. Through you, it's basically just one of the was the request for information for a breakdown of employment for each district level in the Western Cape, which the department indicated they will provide. Another one was for the Department of Infrastructure on slide 6. In terms of the Department of Health and Wellness and the Department of Infrastructure, the 513 million, which was a concern, that was also highlighted, Chair. And then another highlight, Chair, is the underspending of the cost of employment, the COE. Was it mainly due to the shortages for Department of Health and Wellness? Was it mainly due to the shortage of medical staff? The department indicated that we can get themselves, including the Department of Health and Wellness, to come brief the the budget committee on that query of the COE within the Department of Health, chairperson.
Thank you, Mr. Davids. Members of the committee, are we in agreement with the resolutions? Any objections? Member Masipa?
With the last one, can I just ask, do we have to necessarily call the Department of, is that infrastructure or health? Do we have to call it to come here, or should it account to members there? Or can we, are we allowed to? Just that's the question.
Chairperson, through you, yes, we can recommend that resolution actually goes to the standing committee that actually deals with it. Our standing rules does make recommendations, so the chairperson will then write a letter to that chairperson to say that we've taken this resolution. Please deal with it. Put it on your agenda, and then give the budget committee feedback after you met with them, so that we can just read out the feedback. What was the result of that meeting, Chair?
Thank you, Mr. Davids. Members, anything that any of the members would like to add to resolutions? That covers resolutions. Members, thank you so much for attending this very lengthy committee meeting. This meeting is now adjourned.